to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan here with a huge week of World War III analysis. We are here on the eve of the first round of U.S.-Iran negotiations that will be taking place in the country of Oman. They will be discussing the future of the Iran nuclear situation, supposedly getting the ball rolling on a new U.S.-Iran nuclear deal. Of course, we know Trump originally ripped up the original version of that had been negotiated under the Obama administration. Trump has recently given the Iranians a 60-day deadline to come to a deal, or he is openly saying there will be a military action by the United States on Iran. So we're going to be breaking down the status of these negotiations. There's been a lot of rumors if they're going to be direct, indirect, who all is going to be there, but it appears right now that these are going to be direct negotiations between U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff as well as Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. We're going to be breaking down what we think is going to be happening, because by the time you're listening to this, they will have already gone underway, and we may know a lot more details about how these negotiations are going to play out. So we're going to be discussing all of that, as well as Israel continuing to expand across all fronts. They have a new offensive in Lebanon. They continue to advance in Syria, and they are doing major damage to the civilian and military population of Gaza as they advance all across the Strip. We're going to be discussing the Houthi situation, as it appears that the Houthis are willing to come to some sort of agreement with the United States if the U.S. stops their unilateral air campaign against them that has, dramatically affected their infrastructure as well as their personnel. Of course, the situation in Syria with Turkey is escalating as Israel and Turkey have been negotiating in Azerbaijan. We're going to be discussing all of that, as well as, of course, the ongoing situation in Russia, Ukraine, as Russia continues to advance across the front lines. We're going to be discussing the latest updates from, the fallout from Trump's tariffs, as he seems to have canceled a lot of them, but continues to be escalating the trade war against China. We, of course, have big news out of Europe as Germany has formed its new government officially. A bunch of African updates, of course, from Sudan, Congo, a few other places, and of course, big church news as the persecutions in Ukraine have unfortunately, one of their biggest weeks recently. A lot of news from that, as well as the persecutions escalating in Estonia. So a lot of things to talk about. Of course, if you didn't check out this week's Ether Hour episode with Cameron McGregor, we have a whole breakdown of the world economic situation, the future of de-dollarization, and the potential for very large-scale economic collapse, and how that will impact World War III, or how people might even use World War III to sort of reset the economy to their advantage. So we're going to be discussing all of that and more. Be sure to check that out at the link down below, worldwarnow.co. That is how you can support the show financially, get access to all of the Ether Hour episodes. And here at the beginning, I just want to remind everybody to please like the episode and share. It really helps us out, whether you're listening on Substack, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to World War Now. Be sure to like and share, because it really helps us grow the show here and keeps the lights on at the proverbial World War Now bunker that I'm currently located at. So with all of that, Dmitry, how are you doing?
I'm doing amazing, Conrad. I hope you're doing well. Also, in this great week, of course, we have Lazarus Saturday coming up tomorrow, and then Palm Sunday. We're in the last final stretch of Great Lent. But I do have to note that, almost symbolically speaking, just as these big diplomatic discussions are scheduled to take place this weekend, they're going to take place on Jewish Passover. And I think that's not insignificant. I mean, it is the Jewish Pascha, essentially, the old feast day that was carried over from the Old Testament into Talmudic Judaism, edited slightly. And we do know that certain practices, perhaps unspoken additions, were added to the matzah, in particular rabbinical families on this day. We won't get into too many details about those sort of ritualistic, the dark side of Talmudic Judaism here, but it is symbolic that Netanyahu not only met with Trump this week leading up to Jewish Passover, but also that he's also standing his ground on both the expansion into Syria, the expansion into Lebanon. We're not seeing any major changes in terms of Israel actually backing down. There's been interesting news, frankly, in regards to the Israeli opposition to the war, because I think the majority of the people of Israel, even more so than in Russia, for example, there haven't been any active war protests, or besides, of course, the liberals and like the Alexei Navalny crowd, there hasn't really been any huge disruptions in terms of people failing to enlist, or actually, if anything, there are more people being mobilized, voluntarily signing up in order to receive those high paychecks from the Russian government and the Ministry of Defense. But in Israel, it seems like the war fatigue has already set in, and we had 1,000 retired and I think current Israeli Air Force pilots sign a letter, a huge, essentially, complaint to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, asking to and the war in Gaza, essentially. Like, they're not exactly speaking about Lebanon or Syria, to be exact, but they said the Gaza campaign needs to stop. Like, this has been going on for more than a year and a half at this point. We're already fatigued from it. We're tired of bombing probably innocent people. Notice almost every bombardment by the Israelis in the Gaza Strip, yes, sure, perhaps they're initially aiming for members of Hamas and members of these Islamic organizations, but they're also hitting collateral civilian targets almost every single bomb strike, because again, there's children, women, innocent elderly folks, and even men who aren't members of Hamas scattered and essentially living in these very dense quarters, apartment buildings, and streets, right, essentially adjacent to the Hamas bases. And so Israel, indiscriminately, because they definitely do not like Palestinians as it is, regardless of their affiliation to Hamas, are just bombing and continuing to actually bombard Gaza. And in fact, almost every day we have reports of casualties between 10, 30 people, probably even more, that are being unreported because they're still taking people out of the rubble. It's almost like, honestly, when I look at the war losses, Conrad, I'm almost certain that the Russians are losing, the Ukrainians are almost losing probably as many people as there are Palestinians dying in Gaza, just for reference, probably every single day. That's how intense the bombardment is happening. But it isn't equivalent. Of course, Israel has the huge upper hand, and it's these Israeli Air Force pilots who have essentially asked Netanyahu to stop it. And what was Netanyahu's response? He essentially dismissed the letter, said that, we're not going to listen to these. These are political interests that are being pushed by these Air Force pilots, retired or otherwise in active service. Israel knows what it's doing. It's fighting for its sovereignty. Netanyahu is really standing on business. He's really showing himself as like one of the Middle Eastern leaders with a spine of steel. And yes, that steel may be wrought by a Talmudic blacksmith, but in any case, he seems to be adamant on the fact that Israel needs to continue to push its interests in almost every single direction out of Israel. And I think we're seeing that in Amman, in particular, the conference that's coming up this weekend. And unfortunately, it is going to take place literally a day after our recording here. However, I think we'll give some speculative predictions, Conrad, as to what exactly will take place there, because this big discourse between the USA, Israel, Iran regarding the nuclear deal, I think it'll essentially shape what will take place in 2025, especially if the government of Pezeshkian comes to the table and essentially makes like some coherent statements about the fact that Iran simply won't pursue any sort of nuclear militarization. I think it needs to almost sign a deed of some sort with the Israelis and Americans. And I'm not saying this that Iran should necessarily back down from its sovereign interests, but at this point, the USA and Israel, these massive predators who are looking for any pretext in order to commence a third world war in the Middle East and escalate matters beyond what we've seen in Syria over the last year and over the last 10 plus years, honestly. And at this point, all I have to say is that the ball is really in Iran's court. And I think if Iran backs down, perhaps then it will receive unconditional sort of support from China and Russia to bolster its defenses without the nuclear militarization that will essentially provoke the Israelis in the first place. Now, will this deter Netanyahu, his government? Potentially no, but I think we do have to speak openly that I can definitely see Dr. Pezeshkian's strategy in terms of we need to save Iran as it is now. The country has been sanctioned for more than 50 years at this point, or close to 50 years essentially since 1978, 79. So it's very important for Iran to actually survive what's coming now, especially as the economy is headed towards a recession, the oil price is dropping. And as we know, Conrad, when the crude oil price goes to 40 to 45 American dollars per barrel, the US typically goes to war. And it typically goes to war against the country which is anti-Israeli. So I think this is one of the huge fears, and I think Iran can see what's on the horizon, so they're trying to save themselves first and foremost.
No, I completely agree. And as far as the status of the direct or indirect negotiations, these are sort of the headlines very recently. It's that Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has been granted free rein to conduct nuclear talks with the United States on Saturday. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's political advisor Ali Shamkhani wrote on the social media platform X, Araghchi is traveling to Oman with full authority for the negotiations, Shamkhani posted. So again, the Iranians for a long time before this meeting were projecting that it wasn't even going to be direct. They claimed that we aren't going to have direct negotiations under maximum pressure, under threats of force, which, look, it's one thing to say that, but now that they've sort of caved and are coming to the table directly, it's clear that Trump's sort of hardball has been working. The B-2 bombers moved to Diego Garcia, the amount of Patriot and THAAD batteries moved into CENTCOM, the amount of ship resources moved from Indo-Pacific Com into CENTCOM in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea. The USS Carl Vinson is currently operating. It's one of the carrier strike groups, is currently operating off the coast of Oman, where these negotiations are going to occur. Of course, Oman is sort of known as the old grandmother of the Islamic world. They try to get along with everybody. They haven't been involved in military conflicts against the West. They haven't necessarily been invaded, but at the same time, they are very much occupied. They are a big shipping hub that Western corporations obviously use. A lot of the ships that would even have to travel through the Red Sea, some of them originate in Oman. But as far as my prediction for how these negotiations are going to go, again, Trump's 60-day deadline where there will be military force, if that is not met, that's obviously going to be putting pressure on the Iranians. But at the same time, the Iranians know that if they simply cave on everything, then there's a chance that they will just eventually just get color revolutioned by the West and Israel, and any kind of resistance would have, sort of been, they could have been able to resist, but they, gave up too much because, of course, they trusted the West again, which obviously the Iranians know the West isn't trustworthy, but they also know that, a large-scale military air campaign could provoke, more domestic economic issues that could put the regime in jeopardy. So they're going to be trying to play their cards right here. Obviously, everybody still cares about maintaining frame, the sort of public perception of it all. So the Iranians know that even if there isn't a deal to come, they need to present themselves as wanting peace. They don't want to put themselves in a situation where a very easily framed narrative in the media can be put forward that, look, see, these Iranians just don't want anything akin to peace at all. And at the same time, though, we have to realize probably the most dynamic factor in all of this is Israel's perpetual attempts at sabotage. Netanyahu, hearing about all these negotiation plans, basically leaked the plans to the media, and he openly said, well, if the U.S. isn't going to strike Iran, we are going to be considering a direct strike on Iran without U.S. assistance, basically saying Israel is going to strike them on their own, which really throws off any Iran-U.S. negotiations, because why would the Iranians, negotiate for peace with the U.S. if they know that an Israeli strike is going to come down the pike regardless? So that's kind of the game we're dealing with here. But, I know Trump has been getting frustrated with Netanyahu. We remember the Trump-Netanyahu meeting where Trump basically said, he refused to remove the tariffs off of Israel, even though we're going to talk about that later. They did eventually get paused. And then Netanyahu was like, oh, you got to take the tariffs off. And Trump's like, well, you get $4 billion a year from us. Congratulations, by the way. And Netanyahu, of course, looked visibly uncomfortable. So ironically, that is probably why the Iranians are willing to do these direct negotiations. I think they know that Trump himself doesn't want this war. But what they know that Trump may not even know is that Trump is willing to get everybody to the very, very brink. That's literally brinksmanship is sort of Trump's MO. It has been since his first term. The problem with that level of brinksmanship is it gives the Israelis a big open door to just push you right over the line that you didn't want to cross, that Trump didn't want to cross. But, he got you up to that point, and the Israelis, with their regional power, are able to affect a few things that could precipitate a full-scale meltdown into a kinetic conflict across the region, which, as we've said before, is very likely to bring in China as well as Russia. Of course, Russia has been negotiating with the Iranians to try to get them, on the same page on the nuclear situation. It's clear the Russians don't want Iran to get the bomb, but at the same time, they don't want Iran neutered completely. So that's sort of the MO there. But ultimately, Trump has proposed that the Iranians would have to cancel pretty much all uranium enrichment above, very low numbers, that they would be able to maintain some form of civilian electricity generation by nuclear means. But even that apparently is going to be under strict, sort of monitoring and restrictions. So, the Iranians are going to have to weigh all of these things and see if they, see what they're going to want to do. But from Shamkhani, the advisor to the Ayatollah, he went on to say, important and workable proposals are ready, the former secretary of the powerful Supreme National Security Council posted. If Washington shows willingness, the path to a new deal could be clear and smooth, Shamkhani added. So, these are good signs on one level, but again, with Trump openly saying that there's this sort of 60-day deadline before the use of military force, I don't think any deal, even a bad deal, would be able to be worked out in 60 days. I mean, it took Obama, Biden years to come up with the U.S.-Iran nuclear deals that they have been attempting to keep in place to sort of assuage relationships between these two countries. But, Trump obviously ripped all those up, and now he thinks that we can just redraw a whole complex, military, civilian, electricity, weapons, nuclear bomb, entire agreement deal program with this enormous country in 60 days. I'm not necessarily convinced of that. So either the Israelis are already poison pilling this and Trump is sort of more aware of this than we would like to think, or, which is most likely, Trump is just a bit naive. And unfortunately, this is going to be a bit of a proxy war between the Iranians and the Israelis, with the Americans stepping in the middle. So I don't know if you have any predictions for what's going to happen in Oman, Dimitri. I'm convinced that these first few days, it's going to be a lot of bluster and people are going to be really hyping up how amazing it is these two powers are coming together. But I think as things move on over this next week and month, we're going to realize that ultimately the Americans are just trying to dictate to the Iranians exactly what they want to do, and the Iranians are probably going to be forced to admit that the negotiations were never occurring in good faith to begin with.
I think it'll be interesting to see if the Americans, for example, add on certain proposals and elements to the settlement, right? If there will be sort of really hardcore negotiations which will reach a certain settlement. But one of them would be, for example, the RGC's presence in a place like Iraq, which is already developing some pretty hardcore new Sunni movements, these opposition areas, similar to Hamas, but they're not quite Al-Qaeda or ISIS related. So they're not hardcore Wahhabi, but they are Salafi anti-Israeli movements in Iraq. However, the RGC could be even bolstering these Sunni movements. But the RGC's presence in Iraq has been an issue for both Israel and America, some of those American bases stationed there, as well as the Iraqi regime, which is, generally speaking, I would say, still leaning pro-West ever since the 2003 war. And it is important to consider just how much can America and Israel actually force out of Iran? What kind of concessions, for example, can they comment on Hezbollah's involvement? We do know that at the moment, there's apparently Hezbollah's receiving armaments from actually these shadowed ships that are coming into the ports of Beirut and Lebanon, etc., which is very interesting because Lebanon is a very, very heavy, it's very famous, even famously historically, the Phoenicians were always big shipbuilders. They were always these merchants of the Mediterranean traveling around. And to this day, Lebanon receives a lot of these imports and exports from the Middle East out of its ports. And Hezbollah apparently is now that the land bridge from Iran through Syria, of course, to Lebanon has been cut by the HDS regime, by the Kurds. It seems like the only way Hezbollah can actually continue to receive military aid is through these secretive shipments, right, which are coming into the ports of Lebanon. So maybe there'll be certain discussions about abandoning Hezbollah. Obviously, the Houthis as well may be brought up here, especially since they've been labeled quite obviously by the Western media as these Iranian puppets, when I think in some regard the Houthi Ansar Allah regime in Yemen, in fact, is somewhat independent. Like they do have their own personal interest to have decades-long gripes against the Arabs who've been oppressing them, the Arabs from the Hijaz, their neighbors. And, this probably goes back to like Muhammad's time when the Arabic tribes continued to war against one another. There's nothing new under the sun in this particular regard. But I would also say that it's Russia's position, right? If we move to how would Russia react to these sort of deals? Russia, I think, benefits from a peaceful resolution if the US and Israel and, the party representing the globalists in this particular equation, and if Abbas Araghchi actually manages to pull through, if he can argue that Iran should be allowed to actually create and to build more nuclear reactors, because at the moment, there's some huge negotiations happening about Russia actually assisting in completing units 2 and 3, these nuclear reactors, which are going to be standing in Iran. At the moment, Iran only has one nuclear reactor built with the assistance of Russia. It was built, I believe, in 2000. It was started in 1995, but it was completed in 2011. These nuclear reactors take a long time to build, very complex. This was assisted by Rosatom, and it actually stands just across from Kuwait and Bahrain, so on the coast of the Persian Gulf, so adjacent to the sea, similar to, of course, the infamous Fukushima power plant in Japan. So most of these nuclear power plants, in order for them to provide adequate cooling, they do stand on the shores of a large body of water. So very interesting. Again, makes them very vulnerable if a potential war will break out. And we can actually imagine the fallout and God forbid, if, of course, there's missile exchanges, even this one Bushehr nuclear power plant that's already stationed on the Persian Gulf, what kind of effect that would have for the ecosystem of the Persian Gulf and like the waters in general. I mean, it's quite apocalyptically speaking bad. And naturally, if Russia assists and manages to provide Iran with the needed technologies to build units 2 and 3, to complete any future nuclear reactors in Iran, maybe bring that number up to 4 and 5, it would assist Iran in achieving sort of, I would say, energy parity with its neighboring countries, maybe even some sort of hardcore autarky, independence. And then Iran can, with the energy from those nuclear reactors, can potentially begin building up its own independent industry, maybe start focusing on internal technology, innovation, etc. It'll go a long way, this cheap energy provided from the nuclear reactors. Naturally, the globalists don't really want that, so they're going to throw a wrench in this particular discourse, and most likely they'll simply argue that any Rosatom or nuclear involvement will simply potentially lead to a risky development of nuclear weapons by Iran, which they'll claim that Iran is doing in secret. Unfortunately, though, in order to sort of back up that globalist thesis, we have the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Andrei Rudenko, and there's a series of foreign minister deputies in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There's about 12 plus of them, maybe as many as 15. They all specialize on different areas. For example, some are specialized on international terrorism, others specialize on diplomacy in Africa, diplomacy of Europe. Andrei Rudenko focuses in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia on Asian diplomacy. And in particular, he commented on Iran. And this was quite blackbilling. Andrei Rudenko said, if the United States attacks Iran, Russia is not obligated to provide military assistance under the current comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Iran. Now, this is a paraphrasing of what he said, essentially exactly that. And remember, this agreement was signed on the 17th of January, literally the same week, if not the same day as the inauguration of Donald Trump, as a strategic sort of public relations type move, Conrad. Look, Russia stands with Iran. We're going to trade weapons. We're going to have a strategic partnership. But Andrei Rudenko is underlining here that, look, Iran, you guys need to make a peace deal with America and Israel on your own terms. We won't be assisting you if you choose to take a very hawkish position. So Russia's actually, in some ways, the Russian regime is looking out for its own needs, not realizing that Russia's needs, I think, are inherently, at least in the Middle East, tied to Iran. If Iran falls, Russia essentially will be next. There'll be a huge destabilization in Central Asia. The Southern Caspian conflict naturally will move further north to Azerbaijan, the Northern Caucasus. There'll be a huge radicalization. Not only will you see Sunni terrorism, of course, increase in severity, I think you'll also notice maybe even a new reappearance of some sort of assassin-style Shia terrorism, which I'm sure the Americans and Mossad can probably invent out of the thin air. It's similar to how they did with the radical Salafis and Wahhabis, God forbid. Shias do have a history of, say, assassinations like the Ismaili assassins back in the medieval Crusader times. So there is some of that sort of backing there. And I think Andrei Rudenko is just making it very clear that Russia is not necessarily going to commit all out to support Iran if Iran chooses to, again, stand up and position itself hawkishly and doesn't go towards diplomacy. Notice, Conrad, it's very similar to some of those theories that were thrown out in December that apparently Russia was pushing towards President Dr. Assad of Syria to have peace talks with Turkey, right? Essentially on Turkish terms. And when he refused, Russia essentially stood down and allowed the terrorists from the Idlib province to overwhelm the border forces of Assad. And of course, the fall of Assad's cities, followed by Damascus, led to essentially his escape and the regime falling, and all those massacres that we saw in the cities of Latakia, Tartus, etc., and on the outskirts of them. So it's very interesting how Russia essentially is signaling its determination to not be involved in any more foreign conflicts beyond what's taking place in Ukraine. I think Russia understands that economically it's taking a real hit from all the breaking in relations with the West. It's unfortunate that we have to say this, that Russia is at the moment not economically independent. It's heavily tied to China. And if the world does go into a recession, as we'll discuss a bit later on, through these trade wars with China, the Russian economy will indirectly also take a hit, especially if you combine that with the fact that the oil prices will drastically fall, because Russia, again, it doesn't depend on oil as much as the USSR did in the 70s and 80s, but it still depends on oil, except not as much as gas. So that's probably the only benefit. So I just want to mention Andrei Rudenko's comments. I think they're very key in understanding Russia's position. And most likely this is why Russia is also normalizing with HTS. There's a potential meeting coming up between president of Syria. Well, it's kind of unfortunate. We have to call a former Al-Qaeda terrorist, the president of Syria, al-Shara, al-Julani. There's a meeting between him and Lavrov apparently on the books that'll take place very soon. And if that happens, it's just very bizarre. Imagine seeing Lavrov in the same room with an Al-Qaeda terrorist, shaking hands, discussing diplomacy. The world really has changed. It's beyond, say, President Putin kissing the Quran in 2024 in August in front of Kadyrov. This is much worse. It's almost like an extreme example. A head chopper who most likely had a hand in the martyrdom and execution of Orthodox Christians, including two of those bishops all those years ago. So it's very concerning. And it looks like Russia really is on the back foot in terms of what it can do in the Middle East. Its reach has been somewhat limited, and there has been interesting developments, obviously, in Libya, with Haftar essentially sending his sons to travel to Turkey. Russia's interests are very much at risk at the moment. But I think Russia simply doesn't understand, or at least the diplomats are afraid to back Iran to the end, which is why we see this sort of balancing act between Israel, the new HTS regime in Iran, and Russia seems to not really take a strong stance on defending Iran's sovereignty and interests at the moment. So, yeah, extremely concerning situation in the Middle East, especially if war breaks out. On which side will Russia stand? Will it stand on any side whatsoever? It remains to be seen.
No, I completely agree. And unfortunately, I think we're facing the consequences of Putin's comment that he made a while ago to Tucker Carlson on their interview, which he basically said that he doesn't see sort of religion and civilization in a lot of ways as key factors when it comes to this foreign policy, geopolitics stuff, which really just couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, look how everybody else is handling this. The United States is handling this from a great power perspective, trying to maintain its unipolarity. The Turks are engaging in a neo-Ottoman crusade with Erdogan currently at the helm. The Israelis are realizing greater Israel, advancing in all directions, understanding that if they don't become a superpower in the Middle East, that they will be under perpetual threat from their, perceived Islamic enemies. Iran is doing its best to shore up its sort of internalized Persian civilization against foreign influence. And the Russians just seem to be like, well, we're just going to be realistic. We're just going to assess every situation on its merits and hope we come out on top. It's like, that's not what's happening right now. We are in a battle of civilizations, a battle of good and evil, a battle that will ultimately be determined by a lot of prophetic realities. So I think a lot of people within the Russian foreign ministry and the Kremlin are either going to have to wise up to this or they're going to learn this the hard way. And they might end up facing a bigger battle with NATO, as well as a much larger battle with Turkey on its southern flank than they are currently anticipating. But another big development as far as, diplomacy and peace in the Middle East goes is from Dave DeCamp. Houthi official says Yemen will cease attacks on U.S. ships if U.S. stops bombing. A senior member of Yemen's Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, has told Dropsite News that Yemeni forces would stop attacks on U.S. warships in the region if President Trump halted his bombing campaign on Yemen. We do not consider ourselves at war with the American people, said Mohammed al-Bukaiti, a member of Ansar Allah's political bureau. If the U.S. stops targeting Yemen, we will cease our military operations against it. Both President Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth have said the U.S. would stop bombing Yemen if the Houthis stopped attacking U.S. ships. However, the Houthis were not attacking U.S. vessels when the U.S. restarted its airstrikes in Yemen on March 15th. President Trump launched the bombing campaign in response to the Houthis announcing they would reimpose a blockade on Israeli shipping due to Israel imposing a total blockade on Gaza in violation of the ceasefire deal. Al-Bukaiti said the Houthis would continue its ban on Israeli shipping and attacks on Israel until there was a ceasefire in Gaza. When the Zionist entity stops its genocidal crimes in Gaza and allows food, medicine, and fuel to enter, in accordance with the ceasefire agreement, we will cease all military operations against it. Al-Bukaiti said the Houthis would respect an agreement that would involve them not targeting U.S. warships or commercial shipping while they still enforced a blockade on Israel, but called on the U.S. to put pressure on Israel to end its genocidal war. If Trump truly seeks peace, as he claims, his efforts should have been directed at pressuring Netanyahu to implement the ceasefire agreement, which includes lifting the siege on Gaza and allowing food and medicine to enter. Only then will we stop all military operations against the Zionist entity, al-Bukaiti said. The Dropsite report noted that the Houthis have not targeted American commercial ships since December 2024. The Yemeni group began targeting U.S. commercial shipping in January 2024 in response to the bombing campaign that President Biden launched against them. So again, the Houthis seem to, they're trying to at least present themselves as the reasonable ones that, we're only targeting Israeli shipping, not the Americans, which to the average American citizen might actually make sense. But when you understand that, frankly, the U.S. probably cares more about the Israeli shipping than they care about the American shipping, I don't necessarily see a ceasefire coming anytime soon. And while we do know that the Houthis are not going to be defeated from an air campaign, it's clear that not only is the air campaign likely to continue, but the U.S. is empowering the Houthis' regional enemies. We have reports that the Saudi military has been openly shelling and launching artillery strikes on the Houthi forces in northern Yemen near the border with Saudi Arabia. And of course, we've discussed in the past how Russia seemed more interested in allying with the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council, which exists in southern Yemen and these islands in the Gulf of Aden. And again, this is another example of Russia being a bit hesitant to fully throw its lot in with the Iranians. We're going to be discussing that a bit more when it gets to this Azerbaijan stuff. But of course, the Houthi front is not the only front. Another offensive here is going on in Lebanon. This is from the Cradle. Israel launches new ground incursion into Lebanese territory. Tel Aviv continues to bomb Lebanon and threaten its capital as Washington pressures the state to disarm Hezbollah. Israeli infantry forces crossed the border into Lebanon on April 11th, coinciding with fresh attacks on Lebanese territory and coming as the invading army continues to occupy the country's south. The infantry troops entered the Wazani Park in the Marjayoun district of the Nabatieh government in southern Lebanon, Al-Manar's correspondent and Lebanon's national news agency reported on Friday morning. Meanwhile, the Israeli army targeted Abu Laban neighborhood in Aita al-Shab, which has suffered severe destruction since October 2023 until now with at least 5 artillery shellings. A day earlier, Israeli drones bombed 2 bulldozers in Aita al-Shab. Israel has escalated its rhetoric against Lebanon as it continues to bomb the country on a near-daily basis. The Israeli army's Arabic spokesman, Avichai Adre, claimed on the 9th of April that Hezbollah is constructing an underground weapons production site in Beirut's southern suburbs. So we're getting more justification from the Israelis and their Arabic media for future strikes on Beirut, as well as it just described a whole new ground incursion into Lebanon. The Israelis have not withdrawn from the 5 points that they said they would withdraw from, as the Lebanon ceasefire has pretty much totally collapsed. Hezbollah, of course, has been greatly diminished in the aftermath of Hassan Nasrallah's assassination, but they do still have operations and they still do have a large membership base, but ultimately they are facing a big threat right now. The Hezbollah MP said on Wednesday, this is from the Cradle again, that its arms are an internal matter and will be discussed within the context of a defensive strategy to protect Lebanon from Israeli attacks. And this is coming as the U.S. is placing intensive pressure on the Lebanese government to completely dismantle and disarm Hezbollah. We're going to talk about that U.S. veto in a second, because the other big advances that the Israelis are doing is from Jason Ditz. Israeli forces advance deeper as southern Syrians struggle under occupation. Mm-hmm. The ongoing invasion and occupation of southern Syria continues as Israel moves ever deeper into the northern part of the Quneitra governorate and launches even more attacks elsewhere in the Dara governorate. And so this is, again, getting deeper and deeper into Syria, even closer to Damascus. This goes on. A farmer on the outskirts of Kiowa, for instance, reported an incident beginning back in late March. He and others were out picking zucchini, and Israeli troops showed up, captured them all, and hauled them back to Israel at gunpoint. The farmer was eventually released, and Israeli troops told him he's not allowed on his farm anymore. A few days later, he reported the incident to UN peacekeepers, who assured him he could go back to his land. While there, though, Israeli troops pulled up again and drove him off. Israeli confirmed the situation, saying the farmer and the others were released after it was confirmed they were not involved in terrorist activities, but they maintain that his farm is now a closed military zone and he's not allowed back. In Quneitra, in the small village of Turanja, Israeli troops showed up without warning, setting up a checkpoint nearby and raiding the homes of villagers, claiming they were carrying out inspections. Turanja is in an area already within the occupied region, but Israel hasn't substantially taken control of every little town and village they're in. Rather, they are mostly focused on controlling roads and water supplies, while occasionally menacing the locals and causing panic with surprise inspections. In many places around southwest Syria, there are protests against the Israelis. In their recent killings in Nawa, there was a growing viewpoint that they are increasingly living under an active occupation, and they aren't happy about it. Even the ruling government in Damascus, which had previously taken a hands-off approach to the Israeli invasion, is starting to be critical of the aggression, though there is no sign that they intend to resist directly. And that, of course, is because the Druze factions have all openly welcomed the Israelis. The leader of the biggest Druze leader in Syria seems to be much more happy living under the Star of David than under the new 3 stars of al-Sharaz regime. But the big news about why all this is not only egregious on the Israelis' part, but the U.S. is aiding and abetting it even more grossly. This is also from Jason Ditz. The U.S. vetoes Gulf reconstruction for Syria, Lebanon until Israel is satisfied. Wars are costly and often devastating to the local populace. The road to recovery can also be long and difficult. This is even more true in Lebanon and Syria, with the U.S. engaged in international efforts to preclude any reconstruction funds being sent by other nations. Presented as an undeclared veto, the Trump administration has contacted multiple Gulf Arab countries to warn them that they are not allowed to deliver any of the promised reconstruction aid to Lebanon or Syria until Israel's objectives are met. Israel invaded Lebanon in September and carried out a war that ended November 26 with a ceasefire. Since then, Israel has continued to attack Lebanon almost daily and has refused to withdraw troops from military outposts they set up inside Lebanon. The intense damage in Lebanon includes villages of homes burnt by occupying Israeli forces and much of the agricultural infrastructure in southern Lebanon destroyed. Lebanese are just beginning to try to repair their farmland for planting, but they've too come under Israeli attack. Syria's situation is somewhat different, coming off a protracted civil war which has left the country in ruins, and the Islamist Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in power. In this case, Israel carried out attacks intermittently throughout the war, but it was only after the war ended that they invaded outright and have occupied parts of southern Syria. There is no sign that they intend to slow these attacks or withdraw from newly occupied parts of Syria. The UN Security Council is meant to have an emergency meeting Thursday to discuss the matter, though action seems unlikely. If anything, Israeli forces continue to advance deeper into Syria. The U.S. decision to condition Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others being allowed to give aid to those countries on Israel's objectives is doubly challenging because Israel never makes clear what those objectives even are. And Israeli hostility to both nations seems to be an ongoing matter of policy, irrespective of the conditions on the ground. So Trump and the U.S. are openly putting pressure on the wealthiest Gulf states that do want to help, these countries that are, somewhat against Israel to help them rebuild. Trump is basically holding all of that hostage as Israel basically gets what it needs to get done and, secures its periphery and expands greater Israel. But of course, right now, everybody is talking about the resurged genocide in Gaza. And while the Israelis have taken all of Rafah, they're cutting Gaza in half. They've secured almost all of the important highways within the Strip. This is from Kyle Anzalone. Despite all of that, Hamas has 75% of its tunnels still intact and reportedly 40,000 fighters and rocket production facilities. Israeli military sources speaking to the press revealed the lack of progress Tel Aviv has made toward one of its core goals in Gaza, eliminating Hamas. The armed wing of the Palestinian group reportedly retains 75% of its tunnel network, 40,000 fighters, and the ability to produce its own weapons. According to Haaretz, an Israeli defense official explained that Hamas still has significant military capabilities despite 18 months of fighting on the Strip. Israeli military analysts now estimate that Hamas has 40,000 fighters. Before October 7th, Hamas was estimated to have between 20 and 30,000 fighters. Near the end of the Joe Biden administration, the U.S. intelligence community estimated the group lost 15,000 men during the Israeli onslaught, but had recruited the same number of new troops. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated that one of his top goals in Gaza is to eradicate Hamas. However, the war has decimated the civilian population of Gaza. Most Gazans have been displaced multiple times, at least 50,000 have been killed, and countless deaths of deprivation have been reported. Tel Aviv and Washington maintain that all of the fatalities caused by the Israeli war and blockade are the responsibility of Hamas. So, again, I have no doubt that Hamas has been able to recruit from the Gazan population and that some of the tunnels are very much intact. However, news like this, ultimately, how does it not benefit Israel when it is saying, look, see, they still have 40,000 guys. Look, they still have all their tunnels. It's sort of a justification to keep, fully decimating and making sure that Gaza is, as Trump says, it's like a death trap. It's a war zone. It's bleak, presenting it as if allowing these people to leave and, forcibly ethnically cleansing them and sending them to, right now it seems like Indonesia is the most likely, as they have openly said they're going to welcome a few thousand Gazan refugees. Then there's, of course, the whole Somaliland issue. Presenting all of this as somehow humanitarian or the right thing to do just because the Israelis have so brutally destroyed Gaza. And of course, we know the operations in the West Bank are continuing. So before we talk about some of these Turkish-Israeli negotiations in Azerbaijan, Dimitri, what are your thoughts on Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza?
Yeah, I think Lebanon is an interesting example of whether Israel is essentially biding its time, looking for the best opportunity to either strike again at Hezbollah, either to push forward or at least to hold position for a long time, stressing out the Lebanese government. Because as long as Israel remains on Lebanese soil, there's internal unrest in Lebanon. You do have that strife between, of course, the president, the speaker of the House, and the prime minister of Lebanon. They're all from different religions, Sunni, Shia, and Christian. So again, Lebanon is essentially a powder keg waiting to explode. Israel really doesn't need to do much in Lebanon besides, of course, defend its own territories of 5 particular points that it's captured in Lebanon south of the Litani River. Eventually, it can push forward and they continue to apply this unspoken pressure because notice the Western world, Conrad, including the United Nations, despite their somewhat lukewarm approach to Hezbollah south of the Litani River, they do, of course, all accuse Hezbollah of being a terrorist organization. So Israel just needs to wait, continue to apply this soft pressure. Notice Israel continues to be funded by the US. So it's not really a matter of time. Like Israel can take its time in Lebanon. There's no real threats. Unfortunately, the Lebanese long-range strikes haven't caused much significant damage to Israel. I would just have to note that over the past year and a half. If anything, Hamas has dealt much more damage to the Israeli soldiers, tanks, etc. during the Gaza invasion over the past year and a half or so. I think we can kindly sort of conclude that we haven't really seen massive clashes or huge skirmishes between Hezbollah and Israel yet. So it does seem like, despite the fact that, if these claims that there are 40,000 Hamas fighters still around in Gaza, still fighting, and still those tunnels are still operational, I mean, I'm not sure if I believe those claims are true considering how many of the Hamas top leadership have been killed thus far. It does seem like maybe it's a little bit too Palestinian side of those news. But in Hezbollah's case, all the bases south of the Litani River seem to be still in check. There seems to be more or less, Israel hasn't scouted them out. Yes, it's flying drones, planes over the areas, but they haven't moved in yet. So there's a lot of potential for future warfare south of the Litani River, which I think Israel most likely will need to exploit in the future if it wants to secure a proper northern border. And why I say this is because the hubris of the Israelis, right? And I mean, the Talmudic Jews in general. You mentioned, Conrad, how the Golan Heights, obviously the Quneitra province of southern Syria where the Druze live, it's been completely annexed by Israel. They've already commenced actually selling tours into the area. So there are now Passover tours that they're doing this weekend and this preceding week where Israeli civilians can purchase hiking tours on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, where tour guides will show them where exactly the border was between Syria and Israel and where the new border now lies. And they can go deep into 2.5 kilometers deep into the Quneitra province with binoculars, these Israeli tourists, essentially civilians, and look out with their binoculars. Maybe they can spot Damascus in the distance, right? So they're almost showing off that, look, we've already achieved victory. We're going to turn these Syrian lands into like a Disneyland where Israeli civilians and all these Jews from around the world can travel and look upon the trophies of Israeli dominance. The hubris is absolutely insane. And also note the fact that they're sending civilians on that other side of the Golan Heights shows that HTS really isn't a threat to Israel at the moment. They've been disarmed. They've been obviously politically controlled from the beginning. Turkey, clearly beyond just rhetoric, hasn't shown any proper aspirations or moves to counter Israeli dominance in any part of the Middle East, frankly. If anything, it's stifled Israel's opponents in the face of Hezbollah, Shia resistance in Syria, and of course the Assad regime. So Israel, of course, is continuing its dominance, and I think it's really important to focus on that Rafah surround, because as soon as the Rafah refugee camp and that Philadelphia corridor is completely cut, you'll have the entirety of Gaza surrounded by Israel. There won't be that adjacency to Egypt anymore. And why this is important is because Egypt, despite the fact that Egypt is so strongly dominated by American money, as well as, I would say, just is a diplomatic compromise, like they have been essentially conquered diplomatically by the Israelis for a few decades now. And they are financially, Egypt is a very populated country. They're financially dependent on foreign aid, on American donations. Egypt still is somewhat of a wild card in terms of the elites are all military men. So it's essentially just an elite caste of warriors in control of the country. And that, of course, throws in a sort of opportunity of, and maybe even an opportunistic, I'm not saying they will be the good guys, but in a Prigozhin type scenario could potentially happen. And look, I'm not going to be too hopeful here, but Egypt has increased the number of tanks that they're holding in the Sinai Peninsula, just driving these tanks around, maneuvering. Egypt does have some M1A1 Abrams tanks as well, which they've purchased from the Americans with American money, by the way, which is quite funny, obviously adding to American inflation using American taxpayer dollars. I think the number of tanks they have in the Sinai Peninsula is over 300, and legally they're only allowed to keep, according to the Camp David Accords, 230 tanks in the Sinai. So the point of course, Israel cutting off the Gaza Palestinians from the Sinai Peninsula held by Egypt in terms of, through the Rafah camp, is that they're managing to isolate Hamas entirely. And of course, once it's a proper siege that's taking place, and of course, once the city is surrounded, they just have to starve them, which is exactly what's happening. They're running out of medical aid, they're running out of food, water. Eventually, they're also hoping, similar to, notice, the globalists used the same strategy against Russia in 2022 when they installed 30,000 plus sanctions against the Russian Federation, because they hoped that the Russian population would revolt against United Russia and President Vladimir Putin. But instead, the Russian people actually rose up in their patriotic spirit and began fighting back against the enemy, largely enlisting and essentially mobilizing themselves against Ukraine and NATO, which is quite the opposite effect. And I think the same is happening in Gaza, where the Palestinians are rising in support of Hamas and actually joining Hamas's ranks, as opposed to rising up and overthrowing Hamas, because Hamas is the most dominant political party there in the Gaza Strip and has been for quite some time. So I think Israel is really not achieving that success. I mean, if anything, the shared loss of the Palestinians is uniting them in Gaza. And I think Israel's long-term plan of starving the Palestinians into submission in Gaza simply won't work, which is why they most likely have several other contingencies, such as, of course, exporting the Palestinians, moving them somewhere. If it's not the Sinai Peninsula, which I think the Egyptians are somewhat wary against, the Egyptians really aren't fans of the Palestinians in terms of, they know what the Palestinians did in South Lebanon in the past decades. And now this is not throwing around historical gripes, but the Palestinians prior to Hamas's formation were very rebellious and frustrated people, and they have caused mischief in Jordan, southern Lebanon, etc. So Egypt knows this. Egypt doesn't like the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't like Hamas. They don't want hundreds and thousands of Palestinians on their territory, even if they're in these big refugee camps in the Sinai Peninsula. I think Egypt really wants to avoid that. They'll be happy if the Palestinians are sent somewhere to Somaliland or somewhere into deep sub-Saharan Africa. They're happy with that. But Egypt doesn't want Israel to do what it must at its own whim. So I think that consideration is very primal. And Egypt, I think, really needs to understand that if all of the other Israeli neighbors, besides Jordan, are deeply compromised and destroyed, you see Lebanon in extreme strife, you see Syria, and of course the Syrian jihadis, by the way, are already calling for an overthrow of Abdullah II, the king of Jordan. There's already aspirations of these Wahhabi Salafis controlled by Mossad, the CIA, and all these other secret societies, that they will be moving into Jordan soon to overthrow that last Hashemite king. And Egypt will be next, because the Egyptian regime is of course, it's not friendly at all to these essentially globalist controlled Islamic structures. And so I think the Egyptians really should, at least their elites should consider the fact that they'll be next on the they'll be next on the chopping block if things go wrong. And of course, Israel in the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War, they have struck Egypt multiple times before. They do see Egypt as a long historical threat. And even theologically, as we've seen Netanyahu reference, compare the Palestinians to the Philistine pagans, compare them to Amalek, etc. Egypt, of course, is historically the enemy of Israel. It's literally the nation that enslaved them in the past in the Old Testament. And these rabbis, they have all kinds of huge analogies for that. So Egyptians should understand that in the long term, they're going to be next, regardless of how many donations they receive. And I think, as you said, Conrad, if we look at this civilizationally, prophetically, even the Egyptian Muslims should understand that no matter how secular they are, the Israelis are not secular. So especially the Israeli leaderships who listen to these really orthodox and sometimes even Chabad rabbis who whisper into their ears about a greater Israeli expansion, the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the building of the Third Temple. So very concerning. And I'm hoping that the Muslim world finally wakes up to the reality that is essentially taking place in their midst.
No, I completely agree. And I think before we move to Russia, Ukraine, the other big news that's occurring in the Islamic world in this region, of course, are these new negotiations that are being undergone between Israel and Turkey and Azerbaijan. This is also from the Cradle. Israel reportedly made it clear that the establishment of Turkish bases in central Syria's Palmyra and elsewhere in the country is a red line. Military delegations representing Turkey and Israel met in Azerbaijan on April 9th for talks to form a deconfliction mechanism aimed at preventing any clash between their two militaries in Syria, which is illegally occupied by both the Turkish and Israeli armies. The first meeting was held to avoid unwanted incidents in Syria, the Turkish Defense Ministry announced on Thursday, adding that Israel must stop provocative attacks that undermine Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. To ensure regional security, Israel must abandon its expansionist occupying stance, and the international community must prevent this unlawfulness, the ministry added. According to Turkish Defense Ministry sources cited in the Anadolu agency, meetings with Israel will continue in the coming days to assess developments in Syria, and said that the Turkish military presence in Syria is at the official request of the Syrian government and aims to enhance its defensive capabilities and confront terrorism. Talks with the Syrian side are still ongoing, with the aim of establishing Turkish military training bases. Israel is targeting Turkey with false accusations due to its adoption of aggressive foreign policy concepts, they added. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan announced on Wednesday that there are technical contacts in place to prevent combat elements from misunderstanding each other. He added that Turkey does not attack unless provoked, but will act if instability in neighboring countries poses a threat. He dismissed the idea of U.S. mediation, stating that further improvement of ties between Turkey and Israel depends on Tel Aviv halting its Gaza policies, which he said are based on civilian deaths and destruction. A senior Israeli official cited by Reuters and the Times of Israel also confirmed the Turkish-Israeli talks. Israeli representatives made it unequivocally clear that any change in the deployment of foreign forces in Syria, in particular the establishment of Turkish bases in Palmyra, is a red line, adding that any such activity is the responsibility of the government in Damascus. Any activity that endangers Israel will threaten the rule of Syrian President Ahmad al-Shara, it added. The negotiations were first reported in the Middle Eastern Eye. Israel recently launched several attacks on the air bases, and this goes into what we all know occurred, where the Israeli message, which according to Israeli army radio, sent a message to Ankara with its strikes on the Tias and T4 air bases near Palmyra that occurred at the beginning of April, which, again, basically already prevented Turkey from establishing the bases that they want to. The military bases that they were scoping out have been very heavily destroyed by these Israeli strikes. So, and with what Hakan Fidan said, it's clear that Erdogan himself he at least wants to come off to his people like he is serious about holding Israel to account for the Gaza situation. And obviously, they're not going to go so far as to actually sort of advance their military closer to Israel to pressure them for that. But they're at least going to use that as an excuse for why they're not just immediately doing what Israel wants, which in some capacity, they are still doing what Israel wants. They've said that there are these channels to prevent a misunderstanding, and they clearly want to improve relations between the two countries. But I've been saying this for a while now. I think Israel, if they have a bit more resources freed up and are able to look at the Turkish problem seriously, they may quickly realize that the best way to achieve their goals wouldn't be to come up with some complicated partition of Syria, but rather to just overthrow Erdogan and sort of fulfill the prophecies that we know that the Kemalists will come to power. And in many ways, we know that power bloc within Turkey would be a lot more amenable to Israeli desires, as well as much more anti-Russia, most likely fully pushing Turkey back into the NATOist Western camp with which it is ultimately aligned. And of course, the negotiations occurring in Azerbaijan are no coincidence. We've, the past 2 weeks, been discussing the Hudson Institute paper about how the neoconservative bloc in the United States is really pushing Israel and the US to expand its strategic partnerships with Azerbaijan, specifically to counter Iran and Russia, as Azerbaijan, of course, borders both of those countries. Azerbaijan is very powerful lobbies in Russia. They are, of course, the closest ally of Turkey and the closest Islamic ally of Israel, even more so than the UAE, Jordan, the Saudis, more than any of them. Azerbaijan is the true Israeli Shabbos Goy. They provide Israel with a large amount of its natural resources. And of course, they provide intelligence, at Iran's northern border. So that's pretty much what we're witnessing right now. But in the midst of all of this, of course, this is from Al Arabiya, Iran, Armenia hold joint drills amid strains over Azerbaijan and its nuclear program. Nuclear program being Iran's, not Azerbaijan's. But this says Iran and Armenia were set to conclude 2 days of joint military exercises along their shared border on Thursday amid tensions over Iran's nuclear program and between longtime rivals Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia's defense ministry said in a statement on Wednesday that the drills involving the two sides' special forces were to take place on either side of the country's remote 44-kilometer shared border. It said that the two sides would practice responding to attacks by simulated terrorist groups at border checkpoints. The aim of these drills is consolidating the security of the borders on the basis of shared interest to the two countries, Iran's state media cited an official from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as saying. Armenia, which has moved closer to the West in recent years, nevertheless preserves warm relations with Iran, which is engaged in a standoff with Western countries over its nuclear ambitions. Ties between Iran and Azerbaijan have traditionally been strained. Baku is a close ally of Iran's historical rivals Turkey and archenemy Israel. Iran also fears Azerbaijani territory could be used for a possible attack on Iran by Israel, a major arms supplier to Baku. Armenia's borders with neighboring Azerbaijan and Turkey have been closed for more than 3 decades, giving its mountainous frontier with Iran an outsized economic significance. The Iranian border area is at the forefront of Armenia's own tensions with Azerbaijan, with which it has been locked in a conflict for almost 4 decades over the region of Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan has demanded Armenia provide it with a corridor through the border area linking Baku to its exclave of Nakhchivan and its ally Turkey. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan said last month that they had agreed to the text of a peace treaty to end their conflict, but have since traded blame for several incidents of gunfire along their heavily militarized border. Armenia has deepened ties with the West in recent years as relations with traditional ally Russia have soured, with some Armenians accusing Moscow of failing to protect them from Azerbaijan. And while, yes, I have personally put some blame at the feet of Russia for being too buddy-buddy with Azerbaijan, despite the fact that Russia is supposed to be allies with Iran, they're supposed to be allies with the Palestinians, and they're supposed to, frankly, be aware of the prophetic reality of Turkey to its southern, flank. But unfortunately, the Russians, being the practical realists that they are, have seen Pashinyan, who ultimately, as much as the Armenians could potentially blame the Russians, all of the blame for Armenia's loss of territory and sort of demilitarization can be placed at the feet of Pashinyan, who is a Western puppet. And basically, the Russians looked at what the Armenians were doing moving towards the West and decided, you know what, let's just throw our lot in with the Azeris, which I wish the Russians had supported a color revolution of their own and overthrown Pashinyan, which would have been, I think, much more advantageous to Russian interests instead of just allowing the Azeris and these Muslims to do pretty much whatever they want in Nagorno-Karabakh. And as I've said a million times, the Russians are going to come to regret this if, again, Iran maintains its relationships with Armenia while, Turkey continues to expand its interest and the Russians didn't do anything to help. And of course, this, brings my fear to the forefront that when all this is said and done and Erdogan falls and the US and Israel do strike Iran's nuclear program, that what happens with Russia will unfortunately allow them to be cleaved away from Iran and China. Russia will be given a lot of concessions in Ukraine. And then when Russia does descend down through Turkey and reach Mount Tabor, as St. Philomenos prophesied, it will unfortunately be actually to help the West and Israel as opposed to siding with Iran, where in this situation, Turkey could potentially be pushed into the arms of Iran. But as that previous article mentioned, Turkey and Iran are historical civilizational enemies as well. And much like Turkey continues to provide Israel with its energy needs and these other things, in spite of its harsh rhetoric on Gaza, that's sort of what's happening right now. Yes, Iran and Turkey may be saying soft words to each other and pretending to be friends because of this sort of Muslim solidarity that's in the air right now. When it's all said and done, Turkey and Iran, I'm very skeptical that they will be on the same side when the Third World War really starts to hit its prophetic nodes, as it were. But unless you have anything to say about the Turkey, Azerbaijan, Israel situation, the prophetic angle and all this, Dimitri, we do have to move to the Russian-Ukrainian front line.
Yes, of course. Probably some of the most interesting news coming out from Russia at the moment is that General Ivan Popov, if you remember that name, in early 2023, I believe, if I'm not mistaken on my dates, General Ivan Popov was arrested in Russia, and he was one of Surovikin's top guys, shall I say, under, of course, when he was the leader of the entire SMO in late 2022 when we actually commenced this podcast. And Ivan Popov, it appears to be, is one of the proper Russian generals, and he isn't like sort of like a person with mixed background, shall we say. We discussed the fact that Russian generals typically come from very interesting backgrounds, ethnically speaking. It's a trend that came from, of course, the Bolshevik Soviet Union times. But in any case, Popov seems to be one of like the only ethnic Russian generals, and he was, of course, arrested for allegedly embezzling or taking some funds away from the frontline defenses in the Zaporozhye region. In any case, his court trials have been ongoing for about 2 years now, and he finally, actually this week, he requested to be sent to the front lines as just a simple infantryman. And if you remember, he's the one who actually had the telegram chats of all his officers, and he was essentially talking to them. He was calling them my Spartans, and he had like really cool speeches. He would send like voice memos through a telegram chat to his GC, literally like to his UMFIs on the front lines. He was a really hands-on general, actually. Very cool guy, it seems. And unfortunately, the Russian government has just declined him being sent to the front lines as an infantryman. His prison has been changed to house arrest, so he won't be actually sent to the front lines, which is quite a shame. I was actually entirely sure, literally until hours ago, when I double checked what the outcome was of his request, because initially it was actually more or less accepted. Even I think the judge even somewhat commendably said that, well, we'll be sending Ivan Popov to the front lines. That's completely fine. And somebody maybe from the Kremlin made the call, and the decision was changed. So very interesting. It does seem like people in United Russia and the Kremlin are very much afraid of charismatic ethnic Russian Orthodox Christian leaders rising up and maybe making a name for themselves online, as we've seen with the imprisonment of Igor Strelkov. But I won't make any more comments as to that, because you know where this may be going in the long term. But generally speaking, NATO has been losing traction. I think in general, there's already European politicians stating that the coalition of the willing is failing. Essentially, there's no real sure way of securing the Ukrainian victory. They're saying that Zelensky's calls for, a retaking of all of Ukraine for some sort of peace deal where Russia, of course, secedes territory isn't realistic. There's a lot of depression happening in Europe at the moment. But while the depression is happening, of course, the aid keeps flowing in. The European taxpayer dollars, European tanks, missiles, Patriot ammo, shells. I mean, Germany right now has accepted a huge new aid package for the Ukraine, which consists of dozens of tanks, mostly Leopard tanks, but also other tanks, IFVs, the 4 IRIS-T systems, 300 missiles, 100,000 plus shells, all kinds of equipment, helmets, Kevlar, military equipment, all for Ukraine. And if you recall, even at the beginning of their SMO, Conrad, Germany was very much against, according to some of its internal treaties, sending any weaponry to Ukraine, because they said, well, we've had this principle since World War II that we won't be funding any sort of overseas campaign. And in general, we can see the total amount of aid being, of course, given to Ukraine from Germany by looking at the Ramstein base, where the Ukrainian defense minister, Rustam Umerov, of course, the man who looks like literally the happy merchant, shook hands with the German generals. He looks really happy. And of course, the happy merchant has secured aid. So it's exactly as it should appear, $21 billion in total. And this, of course, is most likely both German as well as aid from other NATO countries, because, again, Ramstein, of course, represents most NATO countries, and primarily, of course, Germany and the US stationed over there. But in total, of course, the US has already lodged a conclusive report that they've pledged just this year, 2025, $23 million. And we're only a quarter through the year, of course. So in total, we can see the European Union may be providing Ukraine $100 billion a year at this point, which is enormous amounts, which they could, of course, use to literally culturally enrich and improve their personal nations, respectively. However, of course, that money is literally being burnt in the fields of Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, and of course on the front lines of Belgorod, which the Ukrainians have, fortunately enough, as we move to the front lines, haven't progressed through. There actually was a breakthrough attempt in the Belgorodskoy Oblast. Ukrainians in some high, fast-moving vehicles, not tanks of any sort, they tried to break through. 40 Ukrainians tried to master an assault deep into Belgorod. Majority of them were killed as they were trying to make the attempt. The rest of them escaped. I believe over a quarter of them made it back to the Ukrainian lines. And the rest of the Frontline report is very interesting because we do see more or less what happens. And I mean, this being already the third year of the war, Conrad, we see essentially a pattern. So we see the snows of December, January, February, and of course then the Rasputitsa, or as they say, the thawing of the snow. As the snow in Russia, Ukraine begins to melt, the roads become incredibly muddy, especially the steppes of places like Donetsk, Zaporozhye, especially out there. As you get close to the Dnieper, it becomes very muddy, very hard for vehicles to move quickly through. It makes them essentially sitting duck targets for long-range artillery, makes them targets for drones, of course, and drone warfare, of course, becomes a huge element of despair for the Ukrainians and the Russians making any advances. So as on the Belgorod Oblast, nothing really has changed beside that one assault by the Ukrainians. Zaporozhye remains essentially stable. The Russians are not moving an inch forward, just holding their positions, of course, holding that major town / village of Rabotino, over which the Russians and Ukrainians have fought for literally 2 years now in the Zaporozhye Oblast, which is quite good. At least the Russians are holding positions and not essentially ceding any territory to Ukraine, which I think is super important, especially now that you have people like Stephen Witkoff and you have Dmitriev traveling to the US, Witkoff traveling to Russia. There were all these big peace talks. There's all this talk about ceasefires. Even Aliyev is essentially stating that there's going to be a long-term peace that Russia needs to sign with Ukraine. Of course, Aliyev literally betraying his so-called alliance with Russia in the long term, as you mentioned, Conrad. Very curious. The other fronts of Ukraine-Russia is essentially very similar. So you have positional battles around Volchansk in the Kharkovsky Oblast. Not much progression there. You have, again, positional battles in the Kursk Oblast. Russians have essentially begun consolidating their gains in Kursk. They haven't really pushed the Ukrainians back any further. It has been quite stable at this point. So the only place which I think is worthy of note, in particular in that northwestern zone of the conflict of the front line, is the Sumska Oblast, which is essentially adjacent to Bryansk and Kursk. And this is where the Russians have made significant progress. They've actually taken 3 more villages. They have secured quite a good bridgehead into Sumy. And some of the Russian military commentators have suggested that perhaps the actual goal, in a similar fashion to maybe the surprise attack on Volchansk in Kharkovsky Oblast in 2023, 2024, the goal in Sumsky Oblast will be an eventual surrounding of the city of Sumy, taking it, and of course, greatly throwing off the Ukrainian logistical support for the east, because then they'll need to essentially focus almost a good third of their army and armed forces to that northern side of Sumy, essentially to protect Kiev, because Sumsky Oblast leads directly to the Kievsky Oblast, and of course you have Chernigov. But I don't think Chernigivsky Oblast is the place that Russians really want to go to, because of course you have the Pripyat Chernobyl nuclear zone there. Unfortunately, as I mentioned to you, Conrad, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant is of course offline since 1986. If it was still online and the Chernobyl disaster didn't happen, you would have a similar Zaporozhye nuclear power plant incident where the Russians could take Chernobyl if it was still operational and of course control it as a point of leverage, as an element of trade, which they could use in the future negotiations. But at this point, Sumsky Oblast is the place to really keep our eyes on and look for any news of Russian progression, because it would be very interesting if the Russians actually make some stalwart moves over there, because at this point, it's as much territory as the Russians can take prior to any real solid negotiations between the US, Ukraine, Russia, NATO countries. It'll play in the Russians' favor. And I think, generally speaking, even from a very, shall we say, spiritual Orthodox Christian perspective, the more territory Russia takes, the stronger the leverage will be when they begin negotiating liberties and freedoms for the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, which at the end of this episode, as we'll discuss, there'll be some very gnarly and very unpleasant news regarding the church in Ukraine, essentially what some of the Christians are experiencing there. So that's very interesting. Again, Ukrainians are flying tens of drones every single day. Just on the night between the 10th and the 11th of April, just yesterday, Russia shot down 30 Ukrainian drones across 2 of its regions, flying into Rostov-on-Don, flying into Belgorod. The Ukrainians are continuing to do this, essentially flying drones essentially as deep as they can into Russian territory, trying to bypass Russian air defense. It's really turning into like a nightmarish Terminator Salvation type scenario where you have these flying robots. Essentially, no one's really safe in any town in the Western European side of Russia, because we've seen these robots fly all the way to Volgograd Oblast, for example, literally on the Volga, near former city of Stalingrad, Tsaritsyn. We've seen these drones fly all the way to St. Petersburg and Leningrad Oblast. It's really uncanny how far these Ukrainians can actually master. And they've really mastered drone technology, if anything, which is quite impressive, because at the end of the day, these Eastern Slavs, as you can probably respect, Conrad, they are very good at their IT. They're good at their tech, software. They're good at video games in general. They're just smart people in terms of these particular things. And naturally, it's Ukrainians and Russians being the same. You can see there's very similar advantages. Both sides are fighting in a very similar fashion, except one side is seemingly a bit more Christian than the other. And that's, I think, one of the biggest perks that Russia has going for it. And the biggest news, I would say, in regards to what we're kind of watching it with all due respect and detail, is the Pokrovsk direction, because Pokrovsk is that main city which Russia was supposed to surround a few months ago, but unfortunately the Ukrainians have begun sending in the meat grinder waves. And I hate referring to the Ukrainians being sent into a meat grinder because it's such a vulgar term, but that's exactly how both the Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are referring it to, and the Russians, because at the moment the Russians are holding the village of Shevchenko, which leads maybe 1 kilometer away from Pokrovsk. And Shevchenko is now steadily in Russian hands. Russians are holding it for 2 weeks. The Ukrainians are sending wave after wave at this village, trying to take it back. And at the moment, progress-wise, we're looking at Pokrovsk maybe being 45, 50% surrounded. So Russians haven't made any determinative moves in the last week. Again, we'll keep reporting on this. It's incremental changes, but there has been progress. There has been maybe 1 kilometer of change. Again, at this stage in the war, 3 years into it, it's looking like almost like a World War I pace, which is quite unfortunate, because I think the longer this goes, the more stress there will be, of course, respectively, on the Russian citizens and their appreciation for what this war is even about. And they'll begin asking a lot of questions, which maybe they should begin asking questions, frankly. Speaking of people asking questions, in Ukraine, and this is one of the key news, the Ukrainian campaign to lure young men, the aged 18 to 24, literally Ukrainian Zoomers, into the armed forces of Ukraine has essentially somewhat failed. So we noticed that in January of this year, there were 5,400 young 18 to 24-year-olds recruited into the Ukrainian military, according to official statistics. So 5,400. And now in March, you have maybe 4,000 recruiters. So the numbers of recruits have significantly gone down by about 1,000. And generally, Ukraine, it seems, is really depending on some of these lynching, kidnapping style drafting methods. No Ukrainian young people actually want to join the military anymore. And frankly, by the way, when I give that number 5,000, you can't actually tell. The statistics don't tell you how many of those new recruits were drafted voluntarily or how many were actually forced into signing those contracts. So I think it's very tricky looking at those. I mean, generally, Ukrainian statistics are always confusing and tricky. So at the end of the day, I think we just have to take it with a grain of salt. But overall, of course, the battlefronts are very stable. There's, of course, Russians progressing in Kupiansk, Sumskaya Oblast, Pokrovsk. The Khersonskaya Oblast is completely quiet, as is Zaporozhye, very quiet. And of course, there's no real talk of any extraordinary amphibian operations to take Odessa or Nikolaev, as we've, of course, spoken about. These would be tremendous victories for Russia. But the Russian fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, is undergoing some sort of changes in the ports of Novorossiysk, which is located near Sochi, near, of course, on the eastern side, near Abkhazia, essentially, in those areas. We don't know what kind of changes the Black Sea Fleet is undertaking. Maybe they're installing some sort of anti-drone technologies, maybe these huge some sort of EMP devices that can knock out drone radars, etc. But essentially, these water drones, the Russian ships are very much afraid of them. So at the moment, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is generally nowhere to be seen. And hopefully they're preparing for something special, because at this point, the Orthodox Christian Church is set to be persecuted very actively. And the warming up to that is actually taking place now. But in June of this year, of course, we're going to see that commence with all the fiery hatred that the Ukrainian regime has for the Orthodox Church. So I think it's a matter of time, Conrad. And unfortunately, time is not on the side of Russia in this particular case. You can't take this war and let it drag on forever, because as time goes on, more Orthodox Christians will suffer. And what kind of a Ukraine will Russia eventually liberate at the end? How Orthodox Christian will it be? What will remain of the pious people who were there at the beginning in 2014? The answer is already that number of good Christians has diminished drastically. We know there's a lot of priests who are conscripted forcefully. They're probably dying on the front lines right now, forced to just stand there in the trenches with a weapon in their hands. It's quite dramatic, yeah. So I'm not a big fan of extending the war as longer than it should actually go on for. But again, we're in the hands of the Russian command and their decisions to, force these operations to move. But at this point, Conrad, it does look like, because of the Rasputitsa, because of the mud, the melting snow, and the thawing in general on the front lines of Zaporozhye, Kherson, and even Donetsk partially. We are going to look at maybe a summer offensive on either side. And I think this is probably why Steve Witkoff is so actively trying to meet with Putin as much as possible, trying to, of course, this sort of Jewish negotiation tactic, trying to talk the Russians out of any sort of real moves this summer, especially following the 9th of May, huge celebration, the 80 years of the Russian victory in the Great Patriotic War.
No, I completely agree with that assessment. And of course, all of this frontline movement is happening in the midst of course, Steve Witkoff traveling to St. Petersburg. He met with Vladimir Putin at one of the presidential libraries in that great northern city, the former capital, which I'm not sure exactly what they discussed, but this was their third meeting. So it appears that they are building rapport. There, of course, has also been the negotiations in Istanbul, which occurred on April 10th. And this is from Reuters. The United States and Russia both said on Thursday that they had made progress towards normalizing the work of their diplomatic missions, with the United States saying it was still concerned about a Russian policy prohibiting the employment of local staff. The meeting of the U.S. and Russian delegations in Istanbul followed initial talks in February, after the war in Ukraine triggered the biggest confrontation between Moscow and the West since the depths of the Cold War. The talks were led by Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Russia and Central Europe, Sonata Coulter, and Russia's new ambassador to Washington, Alexander Darchiev. The U.S. delegation spent some 6 hours at the Russian consulate building in central Istanbul for the talks, a Reuters witness said. The State Department spokesperson had said on Tuesday that Ukraine was not on the agenda. The State Department said Thursday's talks continued the constructive approach established in the February 27th meeting. The United States reiterated its concerns about the Russian Federation's policy prohibiting the employment of local staff, the statement said. It said this was key. This was the key impediment to maintaining stable and sustainable staffing levels at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Russia's ambassador to the United States said that the talks had made it possible to make progress in normalizing the two countries' diplomatic missions, Russian state news TASS agency reported. The latest round of bilateral expert consultations on normalizing the work of the diplomatic missions of Russia and the United States took place in a positive atmosphere and allowed us to move forward in resolving this task set by the presidents of the two countries, TASS cited Darchiev as saying. So Istanbul is emerging as a place where the Russians and the United States are meeting. However, they are not discussing Ukraine there, which I believe is a wise move on behalf of the Russians, because the Turks and Turkey are not a neutral party when it comes to the Ukraine situation, as they not only supply Ukraine with things that it uses to fight the Russians, they also openly support the return of even Crimea still at this point to Ukraine, despite it being Russian for well over a decade at this point on paper. So that's the sort of ongoing situation regarding the negotiations. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, the EU has pledged another $23 billion in military support to Ukraine. This was, of course, a new package from the UDCG, which is the Ukrainian Defense Contact Group, which, for those that don't know, is basically all NATO countries plus 25 other members that have come together to an international cooperation level, completely support Ukraine in a pretty much unlimited way. So, Dimitri, I'd love your thoughts on the situation with these negotiations, whether it be Witkoff or whether it be in the ones in Istanbul. What do you think is the future of these negotiations? And as you said, the Russians, they don't seem that interested in discussing Ukraine with the Americans right now, which, again, in the midst of a lot of black pills, that's one of the only white pills that it seems to me that the Russians are at least somewhat aware of the fact that they need to establish the situation on the ground a lot more. They know that the momentum is on their side, and they don't seem interested in kind of kneecapping themselves with agreements that aren't really necessary to make at this point.
I think it's very curious that both sides are using presidential aides and envoys who are somehow aligned to the Talmudic globalist financial regime. Well, I'll just, as we said last week, Dmitriev is very much someone from the Goldman Sachs, a banking background, who's went to Harvard, Stanford, etc. He's a Russian American, essentially. He probably speaks English with a deep American accent. He understands the Jewish ways, how finance operates. He probably knows all about the Federal Reserve and exactly how the American financial system was formed in the first place. And this is who Putin sends to Washington to negotiate on behalf of the Russians. However, the Americans, they just send a straight up Jewish oligarch. And he's a religious practicing Jew, because we know in St. Petersburg, Conrad, when Witkoff visited, he went his first, of course, stop beyond, of course, meeting Ushakov, one of the other deputy. Ushakov is not a deputy minister of the foreign affairs. He's essentially a presidential aide in relation to foreign policy matters. So I guess like a counter to Lavrov, perhaps. So President Putin uses Yuri Ushakov for personal. He sends him alongside Lavrov maybe as a counterbalance and maybe as someone who can report to Putin independently outside of the bureaucracy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Very interesting character. But he met with Witkoff, and of course they went to the Choral Synagogue, which was built during the reign of Alexander III in St. Petersburg just before the revolution. There was a lot of protests actually when that synagogue was being built because of the fact that, well, the capital of the Russian Empire, it's an Orthodox country, there should be no massive synagogue built, but it was built as a certain concession to the fact that there was a Jewish diaspora community in St. Petersburg for quite a while, for like a few hundred years at least. And these Jews typically were immigrants and people who were staying in St. Petersburg for essentially traveling mercantile reasons. They weren't from the Pale of Settlement. So interesting history there, but Witkoff visits the synagogue, so we kind of understand where he's coming from. But where would these talks go necessarily? I think Witkoff essentially is just trying to win brownie points for Trump with maybe before the midterms, maybe before, and he's trying to secure Trump some sort of diplomatic peace talk victory because Trump at the moment hasn't been able to achieve really anything on the foreign policy. And if anything, he's started a war against Ansar Allah, essentially the people of Yemen. So Trump being a peacetime, an alleged personally ascribed peacetime president, he does need something to substantiate those claims. And I think Witkoff is his guy to try and negotiate even a temporary ceasefire, just to make at least the American public again reinforce their trust in him. So I'm not sure how seriously Putin is taking Witkoff's comments. I know Putin he's dealt with not just Jewish bankers, but Jewish politicians, oligarchs all of his life. He's worked literally in the KGB under Andropov. So Andropov was like the Jewish, essentially, leader of the KGB, essentially became the general secretary of the USSR towards the end, just before Gorbachev's time. So Putin has worked with these sort of people his entire life. He knows how to communicate with them. He may even have certain sensibilities to where he maybe likes them a bit more than he should. And I think this is why Trump selected Witkoff in the first place. And probably because of Beryl Lazar's recommendation, Beryl Lazar being an American Jew who just so happens to run the Russian equivalent of the ADL, Feor, and the other Chabad communities in Russia. It's very concerning. So I think, generally speaking, I don't think these Witkoff talks are going to achieve much. I'm hoping that they're strictly speaking, not on Iran and Israel, but strictly speaking on the Ukraine issue. And hopefully, at the end of the day, they can actually secure, and I hope that Putin is mentioning the fact that the Orthodox Church is being actively persecuted. Maybe they can even win some sort of victory for the other churches in the Baltics, as we'll discuss later on. Estonia is in dire straits. So I'm hoping Putin is not being a strict realist about it, and he's actually approaching this from a civilizational Russian world perspective, as he himself has moved rhetorically. Like in most of his speeches, he speaks about Russia as essentially a civilization. And I think to sort of guarantee that, he's going to need to, actually put something out for us on the table. He's going to need to bring some fruits. Maybe, and look, Bob Amsterdam could be also playing a part because notice he always talks to Tucker. Tucker is Trump's favorite journalist. Bob Amsterdam is a Jew who advocates for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I don't necessarily suspect all of his motives to be as philanthropic as he claims. Right? He does claim to be I'm just a good Jew. It's like, well, I don't know about that, big guy. But in any case, it does seem like Putin has an opportunity here to make some waves, maybe win some concessions, and also gauge just how important is the Ukraine for Trump. Because if Trump wants to disconnect from this, essentially this European swamp of NATO that essentially forces America to defend it and fund this entire, structure, I think at the end of the day, he'll be able to gauge exactly Putin's future intentions. What does Putin want to join all of Ukraine? Does he want to annex half of it? Does he want to just liberate the 4 constitutional territories plus withhold Crimea? I think all of this can probably be gauged. Hopefully, Putin is quite explicit to Witkoff, and so Witkoff can directly pass this on to Trump because I think clear communication is important. And notice, Conrad, the reason why it isn't a phone call and it's a personal meeting between Witkoff and Putin is because they can perhaps speak very frankly about things with no chance of any spies, any Mossad spokespersons listening in. Besides the fact that Witkoff himself being a Jew, he could definitely report this to Mossad. Who knows? It's a double, the dual citizenship aspect, the dual loyalty aspect is always kind of at the back of everybody's mind when we discuss these particular people. So very interesting. And I have to just comment on this because in the grander geopolitical scheme, there are a lot of concerns, of course, economically about a lot of these Russian ships, the Shadow Fleet being targeted by the UK, of course, an ally of America, one of the biggest contributors to NATO. We heard about the Estonian ship, Estonia stopping the ship of the Russian Shadow Fleet in the Baltics this week. And generally, even we didn't report on this, but on the 21st of March, there was a very notorious PR stunt. And Trump's interesting comments that, he's like, well, why doesn't the US join the Commonwealth of Nations with Great Britain, right? With the Kingdom of the United Kingdom. I think this plays into this notorious stance that the UK has had in the Baltics, because on the 21st of March, as I said, Prince William, the future King of England, actually traveled to Estonia, went right up to the Russian border with some Estonian tanks and troops. He was dressed in a British, I think it was either an Estonian uniform or it was a British uniform. He had a beard. He's kind of changed his look, so he completely Norwooded out, the Prince William, that is. And now he has his beard, so he's taking on like the Richard the Lionheart type look. Very interesting, and it seems like the UK is very much posturing as the masters of the Balkans. Historically, Conrad, just for reference, the Baltics has always been like the interest point. Out of all the NATO countries, it wasn't France, it's in particular the United Kingdom that has viewed essentially the Baltic as its own essentially internal lake ever since the First World War, when they've had those huge submarine battles against the German Empire. And even since the time of Paul I Romanov of Russia, when the British brought their whole imperial fleet to potentially besiege St. Petersburg from the sea. So the British have always utilized the Baltic Sea to their advantage, and it does seem like in the future we may see some more pressure and escalation between the Baltics and Russia and the UK will be directly involved in that. So interesting discourse. But in conclusion, I would just say that Witkoff hopefully will not achieve any Russian concessions. Hopefully Putin won't bend. We can see Russia being in a huge advantage at the moment in Sumy. Belgorod it's holding. In Kursk it's taking back territory. Pokrovsk will eventually be encircled and taken. And of course in Zaporozhye, Kherson, Russia's holding its ground. So there's no real reason for Putin to grant any sort of concessions unless he knows things which we don't. And perhaps this looming Middle Eastern crisis will force Putin to, of course, strive for a more peaceful conclusion. But we hope that's not the case, and whatever's happening behind the scenes won't really impact his decision-making.
I completely agree. And with the Baltic situation, we're obviously going to talk about the Estonian Orthodox Church, the ongoings there at the end of the show. And, if those things keep up, I think Russia should go into Estonia and just turn it into another republic. And I think, maybe Latvia as well. We may need to be thinking about these things in the future, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We need to obviously discuss the domestic trade war situation, or rather the international trade war situation that the United States seems to have instigated and then pretty much walked back in the past few days. Of course, to hear more details about this, be sure to listen to our Ether Hour episode with Cameron McGregor. He's very clued in the world of international finance, de-dollarization, the world economy, these sorts of questions. So check that out. It's, of course, linked down below. It was a great conversation. We always love having Cameron on the show. But the big news, of course, is that in the midst of every country coming, many leaders came to America themselves. Many people gave Trump phone calls. We're talking Japan, Vietnam, the European Union, African countries, Israel, of course, with Netanyahu coming, which, Netanyahu claims that he came to the U.S. to talk about the tariffs. We know secretly that he was here to make sure that the United States is on the same page as him as striking Iran. But as we all thought that we were on the verge of this tariff war, Trump said he was standing strong. He said, don't panic. It seemed like he was really going to weather this storm. Unfortunately, he did cave to the international pressure. The stock market was losing trillions of dollars in value. As a Zoomer, as a member of Generation Z, I was really rejoicing. Total boomer death was about to ensue. And unfortunately, Trump balked. The boomer menace continues to have its clutches on the mechanisms of the United States government. And it appears that there's been a 90-day pause placed on all of the reciprocal tariffs. I believe that even includes the 10% baseline tariff that was put across all countries. So all the free traders, all of the supposed MAGA people that aren't actually on the same page as Trump regarding trade policy are like, oh, look, 4D chess. Trump, he did what we all thought he was going to do. It was all a ploy. He wasn't actually being serious about the tariffs, which is not true at all. Trump was serious about the tariffs. He was trying to actually institute industrial policy and use tariffs as a permanent fixture of United States international trade relations. But unfortunately, he blinked when faced with the full rage of the international dollar finance system. However, one major player avoided, I guess they didn't, appeal to Trump to try to remove things. They didn't try to make a deal. And of course, Trump retaliated even more. And I'm talking about China. This is from PBS. China responds to new Trump tariffs will raise rate on American goods to 125%. China announced Friday that it will raise tariffs on U.S. goods from 84 to 125%, the latest salvo in an escalating trade war between the world's two largest economies that has rattled markets and raised fears of a global showdown. While U.S. President Donald Trump paused import taxes this week for other countries, he raised tariffs on China, and they now total 145%. China has denounced the policy as economic bullying and promised countermeasures. The new tariffs begin Saturday. Washington's repeated raising of tariffs will become a joke in the history of the world economy, a Chinese finance ministry spokesman said in a statement announcing the new tariffs. However, if the U.S. insists on continuing to substantially infringe on China's interests, China will absolutely counter and fight to the end. China's Commerce Ministry said it would file another lawsuit with the World Trade Organization against the U.S. tariffs. There are no winners in a tariff war, Chinese leader Xi Jinping said during a meeting with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, according to a readout from state broadcaster CCTV. For more than 70 years, China has always relied on itself and hard work for development, never relying on favors from anyone and not fearing any unreasonable suppression. So, of course, Trump had actually levied these new tariffs on China, expecting Xi Jinping to pick up the phone and give him a call and try to make a deal. But Xi Jinping and the Politburo, they decided they aren't interested in that, and they're going to double down and punish America as well. And of course, obviously, tariffs are going to punish China a bit more because China needs the American market more than America needs the Chinese market. We heard, of course, that China might be suspending even importation of American films. I think it's like 34 or 35 Hollywood films are allowed to enter into China every year. So that might, be put to a halt. And if this trade war continues, of course, it's going to obviously have an effect on the potential Taiwan situation, which, of course, in previous episodes, we talked about how the huge Chinese exercises around Taiwan recently are not only, a show of force that they will be reunited with Formosa, but also was a way to relieve pressure from Iran as, of course, CENTCOM and Indo-Pacific Com are sort of the two major centers of U.S. artillery right now. And as Indo-Pacific Com is being depleted for CENTCOM, the Chinese were like, all right, we're going to sort of test your periphery here and make sure that you're spread thin, because we know that U.S. naval doctrine is about winning a two-front war against two other superpowers. So China is sort of pressing their limits there with their carrier strike groups and destroyer ships surrounding Taiwan. But obviously, the United States trade war, after this 90-day pause, we might see if Trump decides to bring some of them back. I wouldn't be surprised if he brought back some of the reciprocal tariffs, but I don't think they're going to bring back the whole huge salvo that they had in the past. But do you have any thoughts on the economic trade situation, Dimitri? Obviously, Russia wasn't a huge victim of any new tariffs or sanctions. However, they have that threat of Trump has already threatened them with other sanctions if they haven't reached a deal soon. So before I move on to talk about the Douglas Murray-Tim Pool situation, what do you think about the tariff situation?
Yeah, look, I think China has, maybe for the first time in its recent history since maybe the time of Mao, has really shown incredible backbone and fortitude against Trump's pressure. Like Trump, this wasn't 6D chess. This was China putting its foot down and saying, look, we may not be completely independent from US financing and the global, this globalist capitalistic market system that you've set up. And our ideology may be Marxist and somewhat literally a derivative of a Western German Talmudic created ideology, but we are an independent sovereign nation. And here you go, 104% tariffs, an insane raise. And the US, Trump just wasn't willing to have it. And so he backed down. And this is quite curious. So Trump, what this shows me, Conrad, is that Trump isn't willing to send the world into a trade war / recession just yet. And that's worrisome because normally, of course, he did say, and early on, right, when the tariffs were first installed, that, everyone needs to take their medicine and that surgery is important, et cetera, right? He made those interesting medical analogies. It seems like there's something more important than surgery and fixing the industrialization of the US. And that may be the need for consolidation around an issue, for example, that of Iran. And I think this issue is at the forefront of any concerns, even more so than reindustrialization, fixing the economy, long-term, of course, breaching that trade gap with China of $1 trillion that he spoke about. These are real issues. But for Trump, there's something more important than all of that. And even tariffs can be put on hold for 90 days, I believe. 90 days from that time in April, that would be about early July of this year, which is interesting because that somewhat coincides with that potential summer offensive by either Russia or Ukraine, plus the persecution of the Orthodox Church. It's going to be a very intense June, July period of this year. So we'll definitely be tapping you guys into the news. But of course, generally speaking, China's support for Iran is a big deal. China's support for Russia is something that we've not ignored. And Trump, of course, understands that. Applying pressure to China was one of his go-tos. And maybe he was even testing the waters, seeing how far Xi Jinping and his cabinet was going to go in resisting some of this economic pressure. But generally speaking, indirect sanctions against Russia would, of course, hurt the Russian economy immensely. And we're speaking about any country that buys Russian gas, oil, etc., even Rosatom, Russian nuclear technology, because Rosatom hasn't been sanctioned yet, which is quite incredible. It's a 100%, I think 99% state-owned nuclear. It's the biggest nuclear state-owned corporation in the entire world. They produce the most state-of-the-art nuclear reactors. They're experts at, of course, enriching uranium, all kinds of uranium nuclear technologies, and they're building nuclear reactors for many countries at the moment in Central Asia, all over the place. And so even France is somewhat dependent on their technology. So if Trump installs new sanctions against Russia for indirect recipients of crude oil, gas, and even direct recipients, this would be a really big deal. Countries like India, some of the BRICS nations may turn away from Russia. Russia will be more economically hurt than before. And of course, if the price of oil continues to drop, at the moment it's fallen, 5 to 7% roughly, that'll also hurt the Russian economy. So I think Trump understands that, and this may be one of the sort of veiled threats or even explicit threats, like he has mentioned sanctions against Russia, but people are just unsure, what does he mean by that? Russia can't even technically be tariffed properly because the trade between Russia and America, I think the total exchange between the two countries at the moment is maybe 10 million American dollars. Like, it's like one large mansion or a house. There's almost no trade between the two nations whatsoever. So tariffs really won't do anything. But what would be these indirect sanctions that can be placed on Russia's allied countries, forcing them to make a decision between the world's largest consumer base and economy, which is America still, I would say, or, of course, young fledgling Russia, which are still kind of getting up off its knees and standing up and trying to assert sovereignty. So that's very interesting. And I have to note that Russian weapons sales have also decreased. 2024 has shown at least a 30% reduction in countries purchasing Russian arms, and the Russian military industrial complex selling a lot of these military technologies to other nations was one of its main sources of revenue. It's one of the only aspects of the Russian economy which is still industrialized and hasn't been privatized entirely during the 90s and completely robbed and looted by the Jewish oligarchs. And that's, I think, a big deal. Whether or not it's because countries simply cannot afford Russian technology or it's a dissolution of Russian arms being effective as per the Russo-Ukrainian war, not too sure about that, but incredibly concerning. And I think when we discuss, after this American story, Conrad, when we discuss Africa, it'll be interesting to see exactly how things unfold in countries like Sudan, the Congo, because these are countries in which China has direct interest. And China, notice, the reason why Xi Jinping is so confident in himself, I think now, and because China has taken its time over the last 30 to 40 years to establish these strong economic overseas relations with nations which are, frankly, a little bit tired of the white man. And maybe you can say rightly so, but from their perspective, they'd rather deal with Oriental people than, again, white people who are, strongly the UK, France, America, of course, controlled by Jewish oligarchs. And I think the African nations they have this inbuilt prejudice amongst themselves. So they have this inbuilt prejudice. And so they're maybe even more predisposed to work with the people of East Asia and the Orientals rather than the white Europeans whom they distrust, unfortunately. So it's interesting how China now has this really strong relation with these new rising countries, of course, still very strongly in the 2.5 third world, you can say, but nevertheless, Africa may be the future of the world in terms of the resources of Africa actually providing a huge technological rise, especially with this in this age of AI and robotics. So it'll be interesting where that conversation goes.
Well, look, if you're Africans and the Chinese can offer you the same, capital injections and infrastructure investment without forcing them to legalize sodomy, then they're going to take that deal every time. But when it comes to the U.S. competition with China, of course, there's been a lot of hubbub recently about how much China's shipbuilding capabilities have rapidly surpassed the United States to the point where it's becoming a military, naval kind of disaster. This is from Rerum Novarum. President Trump signed a new executive order, the Restoring America's Maritime Dominance Order. The order launches a plan to rebuild U.S. maritime power, counter China, and revive shipbuilding in the merchant fleet. The executive order aims to reassert U.S. maritime dominance through industry, workforce, fleet, and security revitalization. The core actions of this are a 210-day maritime strategy led by the National Security Advisor. It involves regulation rollbacks in the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Homeland Security to identify cuts. There will be a 45-day shipbuilding audit targeting specific costs and whatnot. There will be an overhaul in mariner training. There will be all sorts of expansions in U.S. shipyards, investments, these sorts of things. And supposedly within 90 days, they will coordinate maritime trade with their allies, launch maritime prosperity zones, have an Arctic waterway security plan, and assess new industry needs that, in theory, could involve direct government investment and subsidies. So Trump is trying to sort of revitalize not just America's naval shipbuilding, but also their merchant fleet. And again, this comes in the midst of the whole Houthi situation where the U.S. has really had to reassert itself as the guarantor of international maritime law, which the Houthis proved that even a largely sub-state actor can completely throw off with a few military operations. But before we leave the United States here, I had to discuss these few stories, specifically Tim Pool pretty much melting down over the Israel situation, somehow accusing people like Nick Fuentes of being Israeli-run operations in the midst of news emerging that this is from Renegade Tribune, Tim Pool confirms meeting with Netanyahu to discuss anti-Semitism in pro-Trump spaces. Tim Pool met with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday night to express concerns about increased anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the pro-Trump podcasting space, according to Jewish Insider. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tried to push back against anti-Israel trends in the right-wing media world by holding a briefing in the Blair House for podcasters and other media figures, sources in the meeting told Jewish Insider on Tuesday. Among those in attendance were podcasters including Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, and former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, writers Bethany Mandel and David J. Harris Jr., influencer Jessica Krause, commentary senior editor Seth Mandel, and Federalist editor-in-chief Molly Hemingway. In addition to Netanyahu's diplomatic advisor Ophir Falk and Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Yechiel Lader were present on the Israeli side. Pool expressed concerns about increased anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the pro-Trump podcasting space, according to sources in the room. Pool famously had Kanye West on his podcast, and the rapper walked out mid-interview after Pool pushed back against anti-Semitic comments. Responding to Pool, Netanyahu said that this is the reason he invited the group to meet with him. Pool argued that there is a Qatari op to manipulate social media algorithms to make anti-Semitic and anti-Israel episodes appear to receive far more views than, say, tips for picking up women in order to incentivize podcasters and YouTubers to produce more anti-Semitic content. So, of course, Tim Pool has always been a Shabbos goy. Obviously, there's a million jokes about how his beanie is actually a yarmulke. But look, you're probably not going to see us World War Now on Tim Pool anytime soon, unfortunately, even though it would be good exposure. And like I said, he was just lashing out in this insane way. And I'm sorry, but all this, anyone that's openly going out and accusing, doing the whole Qatar thing, isn't necessarily always entirely funded by Israel. There also could be taking UAE money, because the UAE and Qatar are very much, they're in a clash, because Qatar, of course, are more Muslim Brotherhood aligned, still have some sympathies for Hamas, whereas the UAE are like, we're going to discuss this in a second as well, they fully embrace the Israeli camp. As far as they're concerned, all of Israel's enemies are their enemies. And in the midst of all this Tim Pool hubbub, we also, of course, saw the Douglas Murray, Dave Smith debate on Joe Rogan. Just because, Douglas Murray, I believe he lost. I think Dave Smith made better points, but just because he didn't get completely embarrassed, the Jewish media and the pro-Israeli side of the internet have completely taken this and run with it, saying Douglas Murray's a hero, this, that, the other. And of course, Douglas Murray is like a sodomite, Zionist. He's not even Jewish himself. So in many ways, it's even more embarrassing. But we had Trump even on Truth Social posting and shilling Douglas Murray's new book, saying how it's evidence we need to stand with Israel now more than ever. So he's really being shilled right now. And he's been one of the most odious Shabbos Goy Zionists in a long time. So it is not a good sign that he is being pushed in this kind of full court press by the Zio media, because that could easily in and of itself signal an escalation and how they're going to want to put these voices forward for when we do confront Iran and go to war with them, so that there are people that have, quote unquote, earned the public's trust that can run interference and say this is exactly why America should be doing this. And it's not just Israeli interests, but it's also American interests to, of course, go to war against Persia. So we need to be aware of these ops, because they're going to be run on us pretty much all the time. And I'm probably not doing myself any favors. Timcast would be a good place for us to go, but I don't think we were going to get invited on there anyway. But unless you have anything to say about any of that stuff, Dimitri, we have to talk about the situation in Europe. And I've got some information here about Germany's new government, but I'd love your thoughts on these domestic Israeli agents.
No, I think it's really telling. If you recall that Lauren Shen, a relation with Tim Pool as well as the Russian aid, I have my concerns about where exactly that Russian aid was coming from. Directly the Kremlin, or was it the same people supporting, for example, the Young American Communist Party, Jackson Hinkle, Infrared Haas, and some of these degenerate MAGA communists? And most likely it was from some of those Jewish circles who float around the Kremlin on occasion, who try to throw in some sort of distrust into American society of Russia, essentially trying to paint Russia as a sort of subversive nation, trying to promote cultural Marxism of a different flavor. Very concerning. But generally speaking, yes, Tim Pool look, even in the most charitable view, he's a libertarian, which already holds problems, but he's not just a libertarian. He's an Antifa convert to libertarianism. So in fact, he was a hardcore leftist from the beginning. He changed stripes. And then he, of course, became keeps supporting Israel, which Israel is not a libertarian country whatsoever. If anything, it's an authoritarian, conservative, Talmudic nation, right, by their sort of standards. And in a similar vein, he's obviously subverted almost every single message. He's had some great guests on in the past, although every single time, and it's literally EST, a good guest comes on, the guest is typically interrupted by Tim Pool and some of his co-hosts. As soon as a certain based statement is about to be made, suddenly it's, oy vey, shut it down, we have to change the subject. So this is the common talking point. I'm not a big fan of Tim Pool. I never was, never followed him, never supported him. He's just not my cup of tea. I think there's better spokespersons out there for conservatism. I would even say Alex Jones is probably it's better to watch him and actually receive some information than someone like Tim Pool. And
100%, 100%.
Yeah, like it's one of those people who he just doesn't have a long enough trust record in the conservative American movement to even, like Nick Fuentes is a great example of someone who's been around since 2016. I've watched and followed him since 2018, and he's been essentially consistent on the right-wing Pat Buchanan style American nationalist, white nationalist angle, and he has never changed. If anything, he's matured and improved his message and adjusted it as the years gone by. Well, as we all do, as we mature and get older and become wiser and smarter, we read new things. But someone like that hasn't compromised on their views. Meanwhile, this Tim Pool character, absolutely, it's a Crowder type situation. I think it's completely bought and paid for. And unfortunately, these big people like Pool, they do have huge audiences. So there is a certain aspect to, well, maybe we should tune down our message in order to receive this media appearance, right? This is what most right-wingers are thinking. In order to go onto his show, to receive more PR, more marketing favorability amongst a broader audience, perhaps we should tune our message down. But I don't think this is clearly not what World War Now stands for, as you said yourself. So I don't think it's worth it. I think people appreciate the consistency first and foremost. And in fact, that we're simply not hypocritical. We critique Russia when it's required. We obviously critique Ukraine, America, and we praise people like Donald Trump when it's needed, when, of course, they make the right decisions. So I think that's probably the most important set of values you can have, right? Just literally analyzing things and critiquing them from a Christian perspective. And that's not Tim Pool. So that's my sort of short summary of that particular person.
No, I completely agree. And even more than that, I just could never watch the content. It was just terrible. Tim Pool's an idiot. I never clocked him as someone with a particularly high verbal IQ. And it's one of those shows where like I'd waste 30 minutes watching the waste of time, round table that they host. And the moment somebody, even if it's not about Jews, they start to get a little bit interesting. Next thing you know, Tim Pool comes in and interrupts and starts talking about, I don't know, skateboarding or Funko Pops or Star Wars or some other homosexual nonsense. So really no harm, no foul. If we got invited on there, we'd go. But I think we've pretty much burned that bridge. But even in our consistency, as you said, Dimitri, we've even praised, Erdogan, who, again, we love Greeks. We know what's going to happen with Turkey. But because of our honest analysis, we've realized that in many ways, Erdogan is sort of holding back the storm. So even though we don't necessarily, quote unquote, like him, we, with our nuance, we're able to pretty much assess every country for its merits and for its downsides, because we're coming at this from an Orthodox Christian worldview, not being paid by some foreign government, which we may be accused of that, but I can assure you there is no foreign money coming into here. Heck, even if we wanted some of it, I'd love to take, Lukashenko hit us up. We'd love to, but not happening. That's the honest truth of it. But we're going to move to the continent right now. The biggest news in Europe, I think, has been the updates in Germany. We finally have a German government that has been announced. And this is from a German politics channel. It says Germany's new upcoming government's ministry division has been revealed, and it's very good news for the SPD, the left-wing Socialist Party. Germany has 17 ministries. 7 will go to the CDU, 7 will go to the SPD, and 3 to the CSU, which are sort of another regional branch of the CDU, which means that despite significantly outperforming the SPD, the CDU and SPD will get the same amount of minister seats. So just in the fact that Germany refuses to ever have a center-right, right-wing coalition to lead their government, which would, of course, be the CDU and the AFD, to make this coalition work, despite the AFD coming in a very strong second, they have to completely empower the totally losing, totally unpopular socialists so that they can form a viable government. Not only will the SPD get the same amount of ministers as the CDU, but they will get quite powerful ones as well. The CDU will get the position of the chancellor, the economic minister, the foreign minister, the education minister, the health minister, the transport minister, and the digitization minister, whereas the SPD will get the defense minister, the finance minister, the justice minister, the work employment minister, the environmental minister, the development and construction ministers, and then the CSU will get the interior ministry, the research ministry, and the nutritional ministry. Who will occupy which positions is not yet decided, but we know that Merz will be chancellor and that Pistorius, with a high likelihood, will keep his minister of defense position. So literally, despite this huge electoral shift in Germany, the defense minister will be the same socialist that was there before the election. So if that doesn't tell you that democracy is fake and gay and the European Union is just a neoliberal authoritarian entity, then I don't know what else is going to convince you of this, because this is just obvious kleptarchy, just complete corruption. I mean, the will of the people being completely ignored.
Mm-hmm.
And at a certain level, you have to start asking the people that are in the German military if they're going to eventually have a problem with this and start to voice their discontent. But if you have any thoughts on the new German government, Dimitri, I'd love to hear it. But I think the only other real news coming out of the EU right now is the France situation after Marine Le Pen's arrest, as she appeals the situation and attempts to be the national rally candidate for the 2027 presidential election.
Yeah, Marine Le Pen, let's speak about her, because her approach to things has been very much, I think, contingent on what took place in Romania. In some ways, Romania was the test for what can happen to the right wing if the courts essentially decide to intervene and illegally stop the presidential election process. And we see that with Calin Georgescu, of course, now that he's not able to run this year. Maybe there will be more protests in Romania. Of course, we're following this incredibly closely. But Marine Le Pen, actually, as you said, she appealed to the higher courts in France, appealed the decision regarding her alleged embezzlement charges, right? They tried to find her guilty and tried to, essentially, if she would be found guilty of embezzlement, she could run for the presidency in France. This was a huge issue. She's probably, even though she is somewhat Zionistic, not somewhat, but she's tied, we're not sure about her relations to Freemasonry directly. French conservatism is always taken with a grain of salt. There hasn't been really a competent French president since Charles de Gaulle, right? We have to just say this frankly, since the 1960s. And France has been, of course, dominated, one of the most pro-Talmudic, secret society-based countries since the French Revolution. Incredibly concerning, because back in the day, Catholic France was always a great ally of Christianity in Europe. It was one of the beacons. And even before Catholicism took over and the filioque infected the minds of the French nobles and kings, France was basically like the proto-Russia in some ways. The Franks were potentially going to be the inheritors of the Third Rome, theoretically. And, there's a lot that can be said about, especially the first dynasty, the Merovingians, who were essentially the Rurikids of Russia, and they baptized the Franks, and they brought Orthodox Christianity to some of the highest levels in that ancient French kingdom. So it's very interesting history, but France at the moment is in a very fallen state. And the main appeal of Marine Le Pen doesn't seem to be against Talmudic influence, the bankers. It's directed at cultural enrichment. And so she gave a very fiery speech in French, which I recommend people listen to, has subtitles, and where she essentially says that if she wins the election, her party are going to expel all the radical Islamic preachers, which I think we agree with most of this message as I read on. She said the radical mosques of the Islamists, of the Salafists, and the Wahhabists will be closed across France. Salafism and the Muslim Brotherhood will be completely eliminated in France. Notice again how this plays to, of course, the tune of the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way. We're not fans of it, but it does play to the tune of anti-Hamas rhetoric and, of course, pro-Israeli rhetoric. But France, the Muslims really do cause trouble there. So can't really blame Marine Le Pen for stating this. And she essentially said that France will be reformed, it'll be improved, it'll be brought back to that 1960s era when Charles de Gaulle was, in fact, buying gold for France from the US, using American dollars to purchase back French sovereignty. And I think we can't really blame Marine Le Pen for using this sort of rhetoric, because I think in politics, it's such a dirty game, Conrad, as you probably know better than me. You just have to use whatever will bring the people to vote for you. This is why, of course, the liberal democratic model of being a demagogue, of lying, of somewhat hiding troops or giving half troops to your public for PR purposes, it is very much somewhat anti-Christian. It is that Sanhedrin model of, if we yell crucify him loud enough in relation to one particular opponent, eventually the crowd will pick up the chant. And instead of chanting Hosanna in the highest, they'll, of course, condemn the innocent God-man to death, as we'll, of course, cover on this Thursday during the gospel readings this coming Thursday. So I think France at the moment is facing a crossroads of whether or not conservatism will win out, especially given that France does have that huge military naval superiority over other European countries. It would be great to see an independent Charles de Gaulle level France return back to the scene in Europe. Potentially that could, again, assist other conservative countries like Germany in the next German parliamentary Reichstag elections, when, of course, they bring back the AfD, and the AfD, of course, most likely will win with a strong majority, especially given the current deterioration, the huge donations that the German people are giving the Ukrainians without any sort of consent, essentially just by the decision of the chancellor and his cabinet. And naturally speaking, I think Marine Le Pen, we don't necessarily support her, I think, but it would be good to see her as president of France so that there could be at least some independent and fresh thinking in Europe, because Europe has been in this mire of liberal muck for such a long time. And we saw countries like Libya, countries that potentially could be incredibly prosperous in the future, fall to this liberal tyrannic regime, which has taken over so many European countries. And of course, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, there's so many stories of literally objective foreign policy failures. And domestically speaking, we don't even need to mention how many legal and illegal migrants and so-called asylum seekers were allowed into Europe, who now cause and distract the European people from promoting their European Christian values. Instead, they're focusing on the Muslim so-called invaders and not paying attention to the various synagogues and money changers and all the other people ruining their societies from the inside. So it's a massive distraction, but we can't really blame Marine Le Pen for pointing out the sort of clear issue that exists in France. That is, the Kalergi plan is well and truly running on all engines. So that's my kind of short take on France. And I think you'd probably agree that at the moment, France is literally the French people are facing extinction in the long term. Culturally speaking, they're very much, as we saw with the burning of the Notre Dame, facing a huge cultural strife. And if they don't stand up to the challenge, if they don't bring a more conservative party to leadership, and this Emmanuel Macron era, weird, pedophilic, transgender husband situation, if it doesn't get resolved shortly, I think we may see another extinction of an ethnic people, as we've seen so many times throughout history, and the Franks will simply disappear from the pages of Europe.
No, it's very true. And, the big critique I have of Le Pen is her disavowal of the AfD, pretty much kicking them out of her bloc in the European Parliament, which, maybe if she wins, she can reconcile that and the right across the EU can be a bit more united. But, speaking of black countries like France, just kidding, joking around, but moving to Africa, there's some updates. Of course, the Sudan civil war is continuing to escalate in the favor of the junta there, which there's been a lot of accusations against them recently, but the Khartoum government, the Sudanese armed forces that is in power there, that the Russians and others have decided to throw their weight behind. They've actually brought the UAE. They're attempting to bring them to court in the ICC for supporting the rapid support forces who are accused of committing genocide across Sudan. But in the midst of this, the UAE has responded and saying that they completely deny any claim that they even supported the rapid support forces, let alone supported a genocide, which is total nonsense. This is from the AP. UAE rejects Sudan's claim at UN court that it is breaching genocide convention by funding rebels. The United Arab Emirates argued at the UN's top court on Thursday that it has no jurisdiction to rule on a claim of genocide lodged by Sudan. The UAE told the judges at the ICJ that the allegations the country is breaching the genocide convention by arming and funding the rebel paramilitary group, the RSF, were a misuse of the institution. Sudan wants the Hague-based court to issue emergency orders known as provisional measures, including telling the UAE to do all it can to prevent the killing and other crimes targeting the Masalit people. The idea that the UAE is somehow the driver of this reprehensible conflict in Ukraine could not be further from the truth, said Reem Katate, a senior official at the UAE's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She described the case as the most recent iteration of the applicant's misuse of our international institutions as a stage from which to attack the UAE. Both Sudan and the UAE are signatories of the 1948 Genocide Convention. The UAE, however, has a caveat to part of the treaty, which legal experts say makes it unlikely that the case will proceed. And this is from another outlet. Just when we thought Hamas might finally free the hostages, Sudan's Islamist-run army, hijacked by the Muslim Brotherhood, proudly declared it will send weapons and troops to serve Hamas and destroy Israel. Yes, you heard that right. Terrorists helping terrorists and calling it diplomacy. And guess who they've decided to attack next? The UAE. Ironically, the Middle East's most peaceful haven and number one promoter of tolerance. This was said by Amjad Taha, the UAE's geoanalyst and co-founder of the Israeli-based Arab think tank Sharaka. So we're really seeing that the UAE is sort of the main pro-Israel force. They've come out strongly against both the Muslim Brotherhood and against the Shia Islamic Iranian-backed Crescent. So the UAE, as far as I can tell, I mean, yes, they are Muslim, but besides that, they're entirely subservient to Israel, which isn't exactly surprising. With if you look at Dubai, you look at their relations with the West, how they're trying to become this sort of modern oil money mecca. It sort of makes sense, as the UAE is also, of course, very much involved in the IMEC corridor plan that will have an effect on Gaza, as Azerbaijan, of all countries, is searching and looking to dig at the natural gas fields off the coast of Gaza that will also come into the IMEC situation. So, I mean, I'd actually love to look into Azerbaijani UAE relations. Maybe that would be an interesting rabbit hole. But, the UAE, they're taking L's in Sudan, and they're trying to, drag that into this other conflict by associating them with their other regional enemies to perhaps get Israel to support them there as well. But the only other news from Africa I have, this is the headline: thousands of children have been raped and sexually abused in Eastern Congo, UNICEF says. And this article goes on and says, talks about how horrible the situation is in Eastern Congo. It talks about how the M23 militia is taking these places like Goma and Bukavu and whatnot. But if you read all of this article, they never actually get down to who is doing the raping, who is doing these specific things. Because fundamentally, in these African war zone regions, these kind of lawless lands that aren't fully, they don't have operational security from the capital, which is Kinshasa at this point, these numbers aren't really attributable to any one specific group, but they're compiled in these very sensational headlines to appeal to Westerners to, as we've said before, support a military operation that, if it did occur in the Congo against Rwanda, would entirely be for the purpose of securing Jewish-Israeli mineral investments, and then, of course, allowing the U.S. to get a deal to extract them. So we need to be careful of the stories. I'm not saying that thousands of children aren't being sexually abused here, but the United States getting involved in securing Jewish mines isn't going to save these children. What needs to happen is the situation needs to be stabilized diplomatically. If anything, the Rwandans need to be allowed to expand into this area, because look, Rwanda is tiny but a powerful, safe authoritarian state. The DRC has not been able to control the entirety of its landmass and its entire existence. So we can't necessarily allow us to get slow walked into another weird African proxy on behalf of Israel. But unless you have any thoughts on the Africa situation, Dimitri, we need to talk about some church news.
No, absolutely. Horrible news from Africa, and, completely just shows you the savagery of war, and frankly, how morality of mankind has fallen since probably the time of the Second World War, and I would say since the Bolshevik Revolution, when, sexual assault and rape has become essentially a weapon, as we saw, of course, in the dissolution of Yugoslavia, literally during and after the Second World War, all across Europe, and naturally in all kinds of African countries. It truly shows you that, we're closer to the end of the world than further from it. So, as morality, of course, collectively falls away from us. And another sign of, us being close to the end is these mass demonic possessions, which is essentially what the defense lawyer claimed was the reason that a Islamic Tatar extremist murdered an Orthodox Christian in Moscow on the 2nd of April. Now, this particular story, the reason why we didn't cover it last week was because it was essentially completely hidden from social media, and Russian news did not cover it. Now, we can say very strong words about the Russian media, and all I'm going to conclude is that the mainstream media in Russia is controlled by the same people who promoted and essentially caused the revolution in 1917 and continue to spread hatred, not just against Ukrainians and other Slavic people, but also spread this weird multipolarity, multiculturalism message, which again, it's not in the interest of international relations, and it's in the interest of ecumenism and diluting the Orthodox Christian religion in Russia. So what exactly happened in Moscow on the 2nd of April? Essentially, an Orthodox Christian Russian Tatar, Ilyas Safiulin, was murdered at the Church of the Holy Trinity on the outskirts of Moscow. It was a church of Moscow. He was not a typical parishioner of the Church of the Holy Trinity. He was actually a parishioner, an altar boy, and an assistant. He was on the church council of the Prophet Elijah Church in the Novgorod compound in Moscow. Now, he was actually not just a regular altar boy and an attendee of this church, the 56-year-old man. He was actually a missionary as well to the Tatar people. And, Tatarstan is located quite far from Moscow near Kazan, north of the Caspian Sea on the Volga. But what's interesting is the Tatar people are about 50% Muslim, 50% Orthodox. Now, give or take, 5-10%, it changes. I mean, there's no real statistics given this, but very much the Tatar people have been converting to Orthodox Christianity quite consistently for the last 400 years, and missionary work has been very successful. But the battle, of course, is still not over. As we know, the priest martyr Father Daniel Sisoyev, also from a Tatar background, assisted in converting a lot of Tatars from Islam, from Sunni Islam to Orthodox Christianity, for which eventually he was martyred himself. But here we have a repeated story. So Ilyas, and his baptized name is Elijah, so I'll refer to him as Elijah. Elijah was cleaning up a church on the evening of the 2nd of April when an Islamic Tatar, an immigrant from Uzbekistan, took off his shoes at the front entrance, ran into the church with a large knife, essentially at knife point, tied up Elijah in the middle of the church, and then began cutting him with his knife, eventually slitting his throat, and then continued to cut the body of Elijah in the middle of the church. Elijah bled out and passed away inside of the Holy Trinity Church itself. There was no one really around to help or hear him, and I'm sure police arrived shortly thereafter. But what's very interesting is that afterwards, this Islamic extremist picked up one of the icons that Elijah was cleaning, began running around with the icon, looking for someone in the church. One of the people that entered into the church was noted that he was potentially looking for Father Andrei Yakubov, another Tatar Orthodox, another convert to Orthodoxy, the priest. So this was essentially a parish which had a lot of Tatar Orthodox Christians, and he was looking for Father Andrei to probably slaughter him as well. He didn't find him. Of course, police arrived on time, and they apprehended this criminal immigrant, essentially. Now, what's interesting is that the media failed to report on this story on the 2nd, 3rd of April. Patriarch Kirill was immediately informed, and Patriarch Kirill that night, or actually on the 3rd of April, I'm looking at the letter here, Patriarch Kirill sent a letter to the bishop and the priests of those parishes, respectfully asking for everyone to pray for the soul of Elijah, and said that he prays that God forgive Elijah all of his sins, and this is a big tragedy. I mean, a martyrdom literally took place. We know that this was a ritualistic killing because of the nature of it. The fact that the Muslim even took off his shoes before entering into the Orthodox Church really paints a different picture. But the murderer himself, he already completely pled guilty. Openly, his lawyer even stated that he was actually under the influence of narcotics and he was demonically possessed. In fact, I'll read up some of these interesting mitigations that he kind of put out there. So essentially, he claimed that he had a strong neurological illness. He was forced to take medications and he had serious panic attacks. One day, I believe it was on the weekend before the 2nd of April, he was having serious panic attacks. He stopped sleeping and he was claiming to his wife that he was possessed by demons. On Monday, he worked the shift at a factory and his situation became even worse. His family called medics. Doctors gave him a tranquilizer. He felt better for a little bit. And then again at night, he apparently began feeling sleeplessness. He was attacked by demons again, allegedly. So he went to the local mosque on Tuesday. The imam on duty did not help him. And so this man went home. And of course, on the 2nd of April, he attacked this church and killed Elijah during the evening. And what's really horrible about this is the fact that it seems like the Russian media just simply wasn't interested, in the hopes that they didn't want to bring up any sort of interreligious disputes within Russia. There's all kinds of concerns about the Islamic crime rate in Russia is definitely higher than that of the Orthodox Christians. That's why the Russian FSB, the Russian equivalent of the FBI, does not report crime statistics as they do in America, for good reason, because you will see a huge overrepresentation of certain peoples, of certain backgrounds in those statistics. So these violent crimes are not reported. And just to say a bit more about Elijah, it seems like based on even his appearance, he was very meek. And for someone to be slaughtered like this in an Orthodox church, he presented no threat, of course, to Muslims. He was a missionary. Yes, he advocated for Orthodox Christianity among the Muslim community, but he did not deserve this particular fate. And the funeral took place on the 9th of April, a week prior, after, of course, the autopsy and everything else was established. So now that the funeral is over, I believe, on the 12th of May, that'll be 40 days. So if you can take your time and pray for the soul of the new martyr Elijah as he ascends to heaven, no doubt, probably without any issues in the toll houses. And most likely after the 12th of May, we can very clearly ask for his intercession, especially if you have Muslims in your family or you want to pray to a new martyr of the Orthodox Church. I think we've just gained one literally this month in April. So on the 2nd of April, we'll most likely the name of a new martyr Elijah will be added to the church calendar in the near future, hopefully alongside other martyrs such as Daniil Sisoyev, Michael, the guard of the church, and of course Father Nicholas, who also slaughtered in Dagestan, if you recall, last year. So lots of these new martyr stories. Again, Islam it's not a religion of peace. We've kind of stated this quite openly. It's historically not been a peaceful religion, but even worse so, Islam is exploited constantly by these Wahhabi Salafi sects. I'm not too sure if the murderer was influenced by any of these extremist movements, but we do know that Uzbekistan, unfortunately, is turning into a huge hub of Saudi Arabian Wahhabi presence. The Saudis are investing very heavily into the growing Uzbekistani community. They're building these mosques. They're sending these Wahhabi imams over there, as you know. And even if the imams are not Wahhabi, they're a radical form of Sunni Islam. Who knows what kind of people are entering into Russia? The border controls need to be tightened. And frankly, Tatagrad TV as well as Spас TV have reported on Elijah's martyrdom very accurately. So there is Russian media that isn't compromised, but we can't say the same about like Russia 24 or Russia Channel 1, for example. They simply did not cover this story at all, despite the fact that it may be one of the biggest stories of the year. It's not every year that we get a direct martyrdom such as this, like a very clear example, just like in the ancient church. So pray for the soul of Elijah, and I'm sure we could all pray for his intercession in the near future after the 12th of May. So this is, of course, a really somewhat heartbreaking, but also it shows us that Christianity still lives, even amongst new converts. I think he was only in his 8th year into Orthodoxy, so quite a young Orthodox Christian by any stretch of the imagination. Now, this is a story, of course, not related directly to the persecutions. In some ways, it is a persecution, but locally in Russia. But just across the border in Ukraine, in the oblast of Chernovitsa, we've had disgusting footage of at least 3 to 4 churches being raided at night by Ukrainian militia. Apparently, they're supported by paramilitary structures within Ukraine, the same ones which have been raiding churches in Cherkasy. And we've seen the beating of parishioners who tried to, of course, especially parishioners living next door to the church, they probably heard the commotion. Maybe this was even, it's hard to tell from the footage, but perhaps it was even during the Matins or a Vespers service when the raid took place. Some of those parishioners were beaten physically with either batons or sticks of some sort of baseball bats. And there was a lady bleeding from her head, very crying out in pain. So it was horrible footage. Churches directly being taken over by these Ukrainian extremists. And this is why me and Conrad, we stressed when we spoke about the military portion of this episode that the longer the Russians take, the more Orthodox Christians will be persecuted. This needs to be item number 1 on the agenda of the special military operation, frankly. And the fact that it isn't really shows you what kind of spirit probably leads a lot of the decision makers. And that spirit maybe is not that of Christ. So just a lot to consider here. And another very interesting example of, just how respectful Ukrainian drone pilots are. A drone has dropped RPG-7 explosives from a Baba Yaga agricultural drone. These are really huge robotic drones, very scary. I think we saw one in the Patrick Lancaster. We spoke to him about these drones. They're very horrific, right? They carry a lot of explosives. They dropped explosives all around the Church of the Intercession of the Theotokos, around the entrance, and literally did like a sacrilegious procession, dropping bombs all around the church. The bombs did not explode. Now they're armed, lying there on the ground. So, of course, if anyone approaches, touches them, of course, the explosion will be lethal. So they did this in the Negorlovka, in the Donetsk Oblast. So Ukrainians are still committing this sort of crime against literal Christian civilians. I mean, I doubt the military, this is quite a peaceful, Gorlovka, of course, it's quite a peaceful area at the moment. This church was not being used as a base by the Russians. There's no reason why drones should be dropping any sort of munitions on Orthodox Christian churches. So, yeah, just some very striking stories. And Conrad, I think when you discuss the Estonian issue, we'll see exactly how it really shows that the closer we get to Easter, the more the devil is frustrated by the fact that we Christians and even Roman Catholics and other denominations have fasted for so long. We've been in such concentrated prayer that the devil is really uneasy about all of this Christian behavior, people following Christ. And so naturally, the persecution almost just before Lazarus Saturday and Palm Sunday increases in amplitude. And so I think we see these horrible stories come out. But of course, victory through prayer is always our greatest weapon.
I completely agree. Obviously, the Lenten demons are increasing, but just in general, as we move towards the end times, as we move towards the prophetic realities in Turkey and Iran and Europe that we've discussed so extensively on the show, the persecution against the canonical church is only going to increase. And just to give a few final details on the huge raids that were occurring in Kiev, I mean, the 4 churches that were attacked, there was St. Michael's Church in the village of Svetlina in the Kiev province. There was the Church of the Holy Archangels Gabriel and Michael in the city of Storozhenets in Chernovitzy. And then, of course, there was St. Nicholas Church, which was in the village of Verkhnyi Stanovtsi, and also in the Chernovitzy province. And this is from Ortho Christian. The gang of mercenaries that was attacking St. Nicholas Parish was led by OCU priest Roman Chryschuk. Although he hid his face under a hood, St. Nicholas parishioners recognized him. Nevertheless, the raiders failed to keep the church for themselves, because when the female parishioners, and these were female parishioners who were physically beat bloody by some of these people, told the men of the parish about what had happened, they managed to force the invaders out. Armed bandits wanted to seize the church, but hundreds of parishioners who came running to defend the shrine drove them out of the Orthodox Church in disgrace. Having failed to achieve their goal, the bandits, led by an OCU priest, destroyed the altar, the sacristan, and all the furnishings of the Orthodox Church, reports the Orthobook Telegram channel. So again, be sure to pray for these communities and pray that Russia can continue to advance and drive these imbeciles that have been empowered by the U.S. State Department and the Patriarch of Constantinople out of these areas. And this blood of these people that have been assaulted and the people that have been killed here, that blood is directly on the hands of Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. And I think more people need to let him know what's going on, because it's simply unacceptable that he not only continues to allow this to happen, but continues to make public statements defending his decision to grant his tomos of autocephaly to these demoniacs. But the final piece of church news, and unfortunately it's very sad, this is from Ortho Christian. Russian Synod condemns new law banning Estonian Orthodox Christian Church. The Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church issued a statement yesterday condemning the recently adopted bill that effectively bans the Estonian Orthodox Christian Church. The legislation, passed in its 3rd reading by Estonia's parliament on April 9th, requires the church and the Puhtitsa monastery to sever their canonical ties with the Russian Church, affecting an estimated 250,000 Estonian citizens. In its statement, the Synod rejects claims that the church poses a security threat to Estonia, noting that it doesn't participate in political activities. The Synod expresses particular concern over Puhtitsa, which it describes as a shrine of world orthodoxy, and calls on the international community to condemn Estonia's religious discrimination and violation of religious freedom principles. And then the full statement, the Russian Synod went on to say that the actions of the Estonian authorities today reproduce methods that were used in the fight against the church during the times of the atheistic struggle against God. The Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church declares its full support for His Eminence Metropolitan Evgeny of Tallinn and all Estonia, the archpastors, clergy, and faithful children of the Estonian Orthodox Christian Church, under the conditions of increasing oppression against it, calling on them to maintain fidelity to the sacred canons. Orthodoxy was brought to Estonia by Russian missionaries 1,000 years ago. Its history is rich with vivid examples of courageous standing in faith, from the holy martyr Isidore of Yuriev and those who suffered with him, to the martyric feats of St. Platon, Bishop of Revel, and the other new martyrs of the Estonian land. So, of course, we have to continue to pray for Estonia. And as I mentioned earlier, I think if this keeps up, Russia would have more than a true casus belli to go in there and at the very least overthrow the completely corrupt, NATO-backed government of Estonia. But that's the last piece of church news I have today. Everyone be sure to keep the church in your prayers, especially as we approach Palm Sunday, which is most likely when you will be listening to this, or the following week. So let these feasts of the church allow us to, pray en masse and, let our prayers arise as incense, as it were, so we can all celebrate Pascha, even in these persecuted areas. Our Orthodox Christian brethren can celebrate and focus on the joy of the resurrection, as opposed to the geopolitical circumstances that they are embroiled in, that have trickled down all the way to the parish level in some of these places. But we have come to the end of the show here, Dimitri. I would love to hear any final words you have on this week.
Yeah, it's been a very busy week, I have to say, in comparison to the rest of even all of March, and probably maybe even the rest of April. We'll see how exactly it develops. But generally speaking, we do have some joyous times ahead of us. We have the Great Holy Week, and of course, try to attend as many services as you can, whether or not you're Orthodox Christian or even a Roman Catholic, because we celebrate Easter on the same day this year. And I think that should be a cause not for ecumenism, not for some sort of lukewarm co-celebration, which I hope the Ecumenical Patriarch does not participate in, or I hope that no bishop of the Orthodox Church participates in this year, because we do celebrate Easter on the same day. I think it should be a communal understanding between us that, look, we do actually share the same existential enemies. And Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians, we have had disagreements in the past, across Europe and other geographical locations of the world in which, which has been touched by the word of Christ. But in general, today we face literally the same challenges. And so Roman Catholics should continue to investigate their faith and really understand why a lot of their countries today are vehicles of moving this degeneracy. And a lot of them are actually sending their funds to Ukraine to fund this persecution that is taking place against the Orthodox Christians. Like, there's a lot of history which needs to be covered, but in general, I think the Holy Week really calls us all to deep, internal, personal, and of course, greater contemplation of the spiritual realities of our world. And frankly, we do live in New Testament times. We live in, and I would say, probably eschatological times based on what we've heard, not just this week on this episode, but previous news as well. I think times are getting a lot harder. So hopefully the prayer and the fasting will, of course, support us spiritually, strengthen us and discipline us and of course, so we can joyously appreciate Easter when that comes around. And for those of you, of course, staying away from the internet during the Holy Week, you may not listen to this episode. So we wish you a glorious Pascha and a great Easter, of course, in the late periods of April of this year. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all for listening here to the end of the episode. You loyal listeners, the ones that really keep us doing what we love to do here. Be sure to check out the Ether Hour episode this week with Cameron McGregor. Also, be sure to check out our Q&A thread. It's in the chat on Substack if you're a paid subscriber, which you can become at worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. You can ask us a question for an upcoming Ether Hour Q&A episode. If you ask a question in the Q&A thread, we will really do our best to extensively answer it to the best of our ability. And we have some fantastic questions already, so we're looking forward to that. All of these things are, of course, going to be linked down below, so be sure to become a paid subscriber or a free subscriber if you haven't already, and share the episodes like this episode. It really helps us out. So worldwarnow.co. You can be sure to follow us on X as well at worldwarnow_. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. That's gnome, like a garden gnome, rad. Follow Dimitri at WWN host. Be sure to follow us on Telegram as well, World War Now Telly. Subscribe to the World War Now YouTube channel. We have surpassed 5,000 subscribers, so thank you very much. I believe my Tuesday evening World War Live streams have been contributing to that, so be sure to put notifications on the YouTube channel so you get notified whenever I go live at 7:45 p.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesdays. I really went off this last week, so viewer discretion is advised. But if you want to listen on Spotify, if you want to listen on Apple Podcasts, be sure to check out all those links there. You can search those up on those platforms as well as link to them from Substack. So again, worldwarnow.co, that is the home base. Become a paid subscriber and keep the lights on over here and allow us to keep doing these free shows every week as well. So with all of that, I want to wish you all a very happy Palm Sunday. And I want to say that I'm praying for everybody going into Holy Week as well as we prepare for the glorious resurrection of Christ and the breaking of the fast and celebrating Pascha. And be sure to keep us in your prayers as well, me, Conrad, as well as Dimitri. That is the most important thing you can do for us here at the show. And with all of that, this is the end. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.